Okay, we'll come to order now. Welcome to the July 20th, 2021 meeting of the Salem Planning Commission. Shelby, would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Augustine?
Here.
Commissioner Griggs?
Here.
Commissioner Heller?
Here.
Commissioner Copcho? Oh, he's just now getting admitted. I'm going to give it a couple seconds here. Commissioner Copcho, we are on you for roll if your audio is connected. I'll come back. Commissioner McKinley?
Here.
Commissioner Pollock?
Here.
Commissioner Schweikart?
Here.
Commissioner Slater?
Here.
Commissioner Copcho?
I'm here.
And Commissioner Levin has not joined us yet, but we do. Oh, I'm sorry. Commissioner Levin is here. Commissioner Levin, sorry. Do you want to say that yourself? Thank you. And we have everyone. We have quorum.
Great. Thank you, Shelby. It's good to have a full house. Moving on to the consent calendar, we have two motions that we'll be entertaining. One for the approval of the June 1st minutes. But before I look to you, Commissioner Slater, for that motion, Commissioner Augustine, did you have a statement? Did you have a chance to review the materials, or would you rather abstain?
I'm going to abstain.
Thank you. Commissioner Slater, do you have a motion?
I do. I'd like to move the adoption of the Salem Planning Commission minutes for June 1st.
And do I have a second? And I cannot see anybody's faces for some reason. So if you could either raise your hand or tell me verbally if you're a second.
I'll second.
Thank you, Commissioner Schweikart. Discussion on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye when your name is called. Shelby?
Commissioner Augustine? Or abstaining?
Yes.
Abstaining.
Okay. Commissioner Griggs?
Aye.
Commissioner Heller?
Aye.
Commissioner Copcho?
Aye.
Commissioner Levin?
Aye.
Commissioner McKinley?
Aye.
Commissioner Pollock?
Aye.
Commissioner Schweikart?
Aye.
And Commissioner Slater?
Aye.
Thank you, Shelby. Moving on to the second motion, before I look to you, Commissioner Augustine, for the motion, we have three commissioners that individually. Commissioner Heller, did you have a chance to review the materials, or would you rather abstain from the June 15th meeting?
Yes, I reviewed the materials.
Perfect. So you'll be able to participate in that vote. Commissioner Slater?
Yes, I reviewed the materials.
Awesome. And Commissioner Schweikart?
As I only listened to the UDC amendment work session and those materials, I'm going to abstain.
Thank you. So Commissioner Augustine, do you have a motion?
Yes, I make a motion to adopt the minutes from the June 15th meeting.
Thank you. And do I have a second?
I'll second. Casey.
Commissioner Copcho is a second. Discussion on the motion? Great. So Shelby, would you please call the roll and signify by saying aye if you're in favor, or nay if you're not?
Commissioner Augustine?
Aye.
Commissioner Griggs?
Aye.
Commissioner Heller?
Aye.
Commissioner Copcho?
Aye.
Commissioner Levin?
Aye.
Commissioner McKinley?
Aye.
Commissioner Pollock?
Aye.
Commissioner Schweikart?
Abstain.
And Commissioner Slater?
Aye.
Thank you, Shelby, and thank you, commissioners. So moving on to the public hearing, I will open a public hearing on case number SUB-ADJ 21-05. Before Shelby reads the statement of criteria, are there any potential or actual conflicts of interest or ex parte contacts to declare? I'm not seeing any hands.
Wait, hands. I
Is
have my
that
hand.
Josh? Commissioner Pollock?
Yes. Someone from West Salem sent me an email about this. As soon as I opened it up and realized what it was, I closed it. I didn't read the body of the email, and I forwarded it on to Lisa so that she could forward it on to the rest of the commission. But I just wanted to make sure that for the purpose of clarity and make sure everybody knows that's the extent of my ex parte contact.
Thank you, Commissioner Pollack. Are there any others to declare? And seeing none, Shelby, would you please read the statement of criteria?
This is a public hearing to consider an appeal of the planning administrator decision on subdivision class 2 adjustment case number SUB ADJ 21-05 for a property located at 2230 Dokes Ferry Road Northwest. The criteria applicable to this application are found in the Salem Revised Code SRC chapters 205.015D for phase subdivision tentative plan and 250.005D2 for class 2 adjustments. Failure to raise an issue prior to the close of the public hearing with statements or evidence sufficient to afford the Planning Commission and the parties an opportunity to respond to the issue precludes appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals, LUBA, on that issue. A similar failure to raise constitutional issues relating to proposed conditions of approval precludes an action for damages in circuit court. Prior to the conclusion of the hearing, any participant may request an opportunity to present additional evidence or testimony. The Planning Commission will then either continue the public hearing or leave the record open for at least 7 days.
Thank you, Shelby. Olivia, are you ready?
I am. Sorry about that. Good evening. My name is Olivia Diaz. I'm the current planning manager for the planning division. We are here for subdivision and class 2 adjustment 2105 at 223 Dokes Ferry Road Northwest. I would like to enter the staff report, the presentation, and then several comments that were submitted and forwarded to the Planning Commission prior to the hearing into the record. Before you, you have an appeal of a subdivision that was previously approved by the planning administrator for a subdivision of 9 acres into 27 lots. There was a proposal for some alternative street standards regarding the grade of a street, increased block length, and then the street width. There was 2 class 2 adjustments requested for exceeding lot depth and then reducing lot depth for a double frontage lot. The subject property is located east of Dokes Ferry Road, south of the Woodhaven Court, and Kalapuya Elementary School abuts the property to the east. The red line is the city limits line, and the subject property is outlined in black. The subject property is zoned RA, residential agriculture. To the north is a single family residential, or RS, which is shown in yellow. Across Dokes Ferry is RA, again shown in green, and then Polk County suburban residential zone shown in white. To the east is also an RA, residential agriculture zone. We have an aerial photo of the property. You can see the single family subdivision to the north, the elementary school to the east, and then largely the remainder of the land is large open space. There is a park, not directly south, but Straw Park is located just south of the subject property, and then large lot, single family in the surrounding area. So the 27 lot subdivision meets the minimum development standards for the RS-RA zone code. There was an appeal, and the appellants have provided testimony concerning removal of vegetation and trees within the riparian zone mostly. The property does have Wilnark Brook located on the subject property, and the proposal does request removal of some native vegetation and I think 3 trees located in that riparian zone. Wilnark Brook is shown in the center of the blue shaded area. The blue shaded area is representing the 50-foot riparian area. The plans shown, the proposed on the lot southeast of the property is much larger in order to accommodate the brook and the topography in the area, so the larger lots. So this is a closer look at some of the lots that have the riparian zone on it. You have the substantial removal of native vegetation in the area shown in green, which is within those building envelopes shown by the applicant. The proposed tree plan was required to show the building footprints for single-family dwellings in order to evaluate what would be removed from those areas to accommodate the housing allowed in the zone. The map shows 3 trees shown in red, which will be removed in order to construct the dwelling within those building footprints on lot 8, 9, and 12, I believe. The yellow, there's a tree shown in yellow that's really close to the riparian area, but appears to be outside according to the applicant's materials. The areas shown in green here and on the next slide do disturb less than 1,500 square feet of vegetation removal within that riparian area. There were some trees shown on the south side of the brook for removal, and there was a condition 9 requiring that all of those trees be preserved. So this is the map just moving north, again showing the green areas is where the vegetation removal is proposed. The planning administrator's decision did condition that new single-family dwellings would have to be located within those building envelopes to mitigate the disturbance of the riparian area. So we have some pictures. So this is looking north. The property, I believe, used to be a Christmas tree farm. There's some really large trees and all in a perfect line on the property, and then the vegetation around the brook. And then you can see the Calapooya School to the east of the property. So this is looking south-ish, and you can see Straub Natural Park to the south. And there's some pictures of Dokes Ferry. The subject property is shown with the yellow arrow. The applicant did request to change language for condition 12 as clarified in your staff report for a need to clarify the need for a delineation for a permit from the Department of State Lands. Staff supports the language change and staff recommends affirming the planning administrator's decision and approving the application. I'm available for any questions, and so is Glenn Davis from Public Works.
If you can use raise the hand feature, I can more easily find you for questions of Olivia this time. No.
Commissioner Schweikart has her hand raised.
Okay.
I don't know if they changed the settings, but the hands look a little different, so I don't
Okay,
know if it's
Commissioner
less
Pollock.
noticeable.
I see Commissioner Pollock. Who else had their hand raised? Shelby?
Commissioner Schweikart.
Okay. We'll start with Commissioner Schweikart and we'll move then to Commissioner Pollock.
Thanks, Olivia. I had one question, which was that you mentioned needing to see the building pad outlines for the properties that are abutting the riparian zone. And I was wondering, is it then conditioned that the lots are utilized in that fashion, that the buildable area is where they have outlined it on that plan sheet?
So the condition of approval requires that the building of the single family dwelling would be within that building envelope. No construction outside of that envelope was reviewed. So that if in the future we don't have within the riparian area, there's not a no build within that 50 feet. We were strictly reviewing the tree removal and the vegetation removal. So in the future, if a homeowner wanted to build something, an accessory structure or something, they would have to come in and ask for the same, for a permit, tree removal permit, or a vegetation removal permit from us to meet that section of code. So we're evaluating that for a dwelling to ensure that the properties are buildable.
Okay, so then there is, I guess, some, and maybe I missed the language, but that basically when the if it was like, say, all of these units were being built at the same time, if someone came in to do the building permit, pull the building permits, they would have to show that they were utilizing those same square footages that you outline, or that the applicant outlines in the plan sheet.
Yeah, the condition 11, any construction or grading on 8, 9, 12, or 13 shall remain within the building footprints shown on the subdivision plan.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Commissioner Pollak. Commissioner Pollak, I can't hear you.
Sorry, faked you guys out. There was a lot of statements and reports and things that we received today. Was that within the public realm? In other words, is there any cutoff days that wouldn't allow us to see this stuff, or can we review this stuff?
Everything that was submitted today that shall be sent out was entered into the record, so it would be for you to review.
Okay. No, that's all I have to ask right now. Thank you.
Okay. Others by raising the hand, your hand. Shelby, you'll help me if you see somebody I'm not seeing, but I don't see other questions at this point, or at least I don't see raised hands.
I don't have any either.
Okay. So thank you, Olivia. Representing the applicant, I think we have Mr. Hoyt here. Would you like to speak to the commission? And just a reminder, Mr. Hoyt, that you have 15 minutes.
Thank you. I'll use 10 minutes at this time and save 5 minutes for rebuttal should it be necessary. I want to thank the commissioners for being here. I want to thank the staff for their work on this application. What we have here is a project that recognizes the uniqueness of this land. And there's been a lot of community concern raised about this project because of the presence of Brook. And I think if you take a moment to look at the design and the request for adjustments, what you will see is that this is a project that was designed to respect the environment and protect and preserve it. It is a low density project, less than 3 units or approximately 3 units per acre. It does not cross Brook. It leaves that brook undisturbed, leaving the balance of the property there. There are large lots. That's one of the exceptions that you see the request for, so that those lots can be bigger and leave those areas protected and untouched. The project does not cross the Riparian Corridor. There are very minor intrusions into the Riparian Corridor from those building envelopes. And as was noted earlier by the staff response, no building can take place outside those riparian envelopes. Any impact inside those must be done in pursuant to the tree plan and the vegetation removal plan, so it'll be tightly regulated. The design standards are intended to and do protect that riparian corridor. Some of the materials that were submitted recently raised some questions about cutting that took place in Gold Creek. And when you look at the information presented, one of the things that I think is important, and I'm going to share a portion of my screen for a moment so you can see those, is that what you'll see on this screen is the old standards under which the cutting on Gold Creek took place were very different than the new standards. And those new standards require that erosive flows be detained, that the post-development discharge is controlled and is 50% of a 2-year, 24-hour storm, that 80% of the average rainfall is treated, and a 100% storm event can be stored on the property. Those are the standards that were advocated to be used in protecting Gold Creek. And those are the standards to which this project is designed. So it has been a project that not only in the layout of the lots, but in the preparation for stormwater treatment and stormwater management will meet the very same standards that are being used and purported to fix a problem that's already been created by prior standards that were more lax. And if you took a look at those materials, you'll see there's lots of discharge uncontrolled into those creeks. That's not something that will be part of this project. It's been conditioned in that way. All of the adjustments that you heard about here are sought not to enhance the developer's opportunity to develop the land, but to protect the land. The streets are reduced in size. That reduces impervious surface, that reduces stormwater that's not naturally absorbed onto the property. The lots are made larger and configured oddly in order to preserve and protect the streamland, which leaves it undeveloped and leaves a buffer between this subdivision and the elementary school behind. And the street lengths are done again to design a street layout that allows for access for the property to the limited number of homes that are proposed but still minimizes the amount of asphalt on the property. So the design itself recognizes many of the questions raised by the opponents. One of the issues raised is that not all of the waterways on site were identified. There's only one identified waterway on site. There's a few pieces of information I think are important to look at as it relates to that. One is the City of Salem requires that waterways be identified by the director. The director has only identified a single waterway. Again, I'll share my screen for a moment and show you information that comes from the Department of State Lands. They have identified the waterways on site, and what you will see in that context is there's a single waterway, which is Willock Brook. And the riparian area for Willock Brook you saw identified in the materials that were presented by staff. And this is the same material that was identified at the same location as identified by the Department of State Lands. Similarly, the Oregon Water Resources Department has also identified the waterways on the site. And I will share with you the Oregon Department of Waterways information. Again, it shows only Willock Brook running through the property, and that is the waterway that has been identified in the riparian area that has been identified on the maps and protected. So there's been a substantial amount of work done to identify that riparian area. There are two channels that are referenced as potential tributaries to that area. One of those is south of Willock Brook and is completely unaffected by the development. It's on the opposite side of the riparian area. It's not touched. The other, we've had a wetlands delineation is in process. And if there's wetlands there, we will have to go through the wetlands process to address any impacts on that property. One of the significant concerns that is legitimate regarding the property because of the presence of Willock Brook is the presence of wetlands. The City of Salem's code requires that DSL be notified that there's a development taking place. DSL was so notified. DSL, the conditions require, we've asked they be slightly modified to just add some clarity, not to lighten the burden. But that DSL be provided a delineation and that DSL must concur in that delineation. And if that concurred delineation requires any permits, that we be required to obtain those permits, which is a common practice in terms of conditioning developments and requiring DSL compliance. Wetlands are regulated by the state and the federal government, through the Corps of Engineers, where we're going to be required to go through all of their process based on that delineation and do that as part of the conditions of approval. So the wetlands on the property are going to be protected as envisioned not only by the City of Salem code, but as required by state and federal law. There's some reference to fish on the property. There are some fish that have been identified by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. One of the letters that was submitted today was a letter from the Department of Fish and Wildlife that identifies, yes, there have been fish identified in Willock Brook and only in Willock Brook, not in any of the potential perennial stream tributaries that are there. None of those fish are listed as endangered species. The appellant's materials, if you look at those, reference the fact that they are not listed species. Willock Brook is protected through the Riparian Corridor, through not being crossed, through the lot design, through the street designs that do that. Any habitat that's associated with those fish, one, because they're not endangered, it's not a code requirement that has to be met. But even so, the Willock Brook itself is addressed there or protected through the design of the project. There's some reference to chemicals on the site from prior farming activities. There's no evidence of that in any way. No indication that the site is in any way unhealthy, no indication there's any health threat associated with any chemicals present on the site. We've had a geotechnical analysis done, and that geotechnical analysis concluded that if the recommendations in that report are followed, the site can be safely developed without threat or instability. There's no indication anything contrary to that report and its analysis of the property. And test pits were dug, the required work was performed, that information was presented to and reviewed by staff. So, and it contains specific requirements for the building and construction of the subdivision. Staff had the opportunity to review the application, review the comments previously submitted, and concluded that the application met all of the applicable criteria. They had the further benefit of all of the issues raised in the appeals, and staff again had an additional opportunity to review and comment on those, and again concluded that the application as presented does meet those criteria. We believe that the careful, creative, low-density design of this project that protects the Riparian Corridor and allows the presence of single-family residences in the growing West Salem area and near schools represents the kind of planning that the city should be encouraging and supporting. We thank the staff for their work in reviewing the criteria and finding that we meet those. And I'd be happy to answer any questions in the minute and a half I have left in my first 10 minutes.
And actually, Mark, you have 15 minutes, so you really have 5 more plus your 5 for rebuttal. So I mean,
Well,
you could go on and on if you like.
I'm happy to keep talking, except I'm sure you've heard enough of people like me. If there's more you'd like me to address, or if people have questions, I'm happy to address them. But
Great. Looks like we've got a couple of commissioners with questions right off the bat. Commissioner Pollock, followed by Commissioner Swikart.
Well, thank you for those. It does, you did address a lot of my questions, but first of all, it's been my experience for the innocent landowner defense states that anytime property is put into action, for a lender not to be held responsible for any contamination on site, they will require a phase 1 environmental assessment. Has there been a phase 1 environmental assessment done on this particular property to date?
I am not aware, nor do I believe that necessarily is required in.
It's not. There's nothing required. It's just
right.
The market.
I don't believe one. Mark Grenz and Jeremy Grenz, who have been working with the experts throughout the development of this application, are on the line and can probably answer that specifically for you. To my knowledge, that has not been done, nor has there been any indication raised that it would be needed. It's been a single family residence. There hasn't been any indication of contamination that we have seen in developing the information that's been developed so far regarding the property.
Okay. So, I would just ask this, if I can, President, can I follow up?
Yeah, and I just wanted to note for the record, Mark Grins was shaking his head, so nothing has been done.
Oh, okay, great.
For the record.
So it's, and I will say this because I've done phase 1s in other projects, and basically it's the bank who requires it. So will there be, and so has it been your experience here in Oregon where a bank will require a phase 1 before they'll lend money for a development?
Typically, the answer is yes.
Thank you very much.
Very seldom do banks want to let go of their money if they're going to end up with environmental liability. They require that be cleaned up and a clean bill of health be issued. The answer is yes.
Thank you. That's what I wanted to hear for the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Pollock. Commissioner Schweikart, followed by Commissioner Heller.
All right, thanks. I have 2 questions. The first one is, you were mentioning in your remarks the thoughtful layout of these lots, and in an attempt to minimize the amount of development within the Riparian Corridor. And one of the questions I had, because I noted in your application that lot number 16 is the water quality detention lot, so it was designated for that purpose. And so what factors were considered in citing the detention pond on that piece versus other potential areas of the site? Was it topography, or what was the thought there?
I'm going to need to defer to either Mark or Jeremy Grenz on what specifically went into that.
Mr. Grenz, would you like to state your name and address for the record and then respond to that question? And you're on, yeah, you got it.
Good evening. My name is Mark Grenz and I'm with Multi-Tech Engineering. Our office is 1155 13th Street Southeast. And we have been doing the detailed engineering work in part of this application. The water quality stormwater detention facility was located in that particular spot due to topography. So it has to be located in order to capture all of the water and treat the water that needs to be treated. It has to go at the lower part of the site. And when we did that, we took into consideration that portion of the site at the low end that was adjacent to the waterway that was such that we could construct the type of facility that we need to. So they can't just go anywhere. And so that's why that was selected.
Did you have a follow-up question, Commissioner Schweikart, or a separate question?
I have a separate question. Thank you, Mark. The separate question I had was in looking at the applicants' proposed findings regarding appeal issues. You mentioned that that there was a a notice sent to DSL, and so I just want to make sure I understand. So is the current status of the communication that they are going to provide? They've been noticed about the application for subdivision, and then their letter of concurrence letter, would that then set forth the conditions, the requirements for something like the wetland delineation report or further information?
So DSL has responded to the notice indicating that they believe that there could be jurisdictional wetlands on the site and recommending a delineation. In response to that recommendation, the delineation is underway. That delineation will be sent to DSL for their review, their site inspection, and their concurrence as part of the normal process. So a wetlands delineation inspection with all of its required reports will be sent to DSL for their review to determine whether they can agree, disagree, want to expand or narrow the scope of that determination. That's in process.
Okay. So they've already responded saying that they think that you need that wetland. And so, and what's the, I know it's sort of different in every state, but what's the kind of relationship then with what you would be providing to the Army Corps and with the Army Corps, how that communication is going to work?
It varies by project and the nature and extent of the amount of dirt moved. If there's going to be development in the wetlands, then the Corps is potentially involved in the permitting process associated with the dirt placement or dirt removal in a jurisdictional wetland. And DSL the two of them work hand in hand to make sure that both are met.
Okay. Yeah. In my experience, I know that it depends, but like, that you could possibly have mitigation measures that are applied by one or the other of the state or federal regulatory bodies that have to do with replacement rates of native species and that kind of thing. And so that's the kind of work that you're expecting?
We will be required to go through that process, yes.
Okay. Thanks, that's it.
Commissioner Heller.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to ask about, I read somewhere in all this material about the size of the footprints of the dwellings that are planned for this project. Could you refresh my memory on what that was?
I don't have the specific size at my fingertips. What I can tell you is that those building footprints that are reflected on the plat are larger than the anticipated homes. They provide flexibility in location. And one of the questions that came up when we saw the initial approval and the appeal was that any work in the Riparian Corridor is limited by the conditions. That's actually, as staff noted, requires more than code. The code is less conservative than that. And so we reviewed the issue of, do we want to push for the level of flexibility that the code actually allows, which is more than the condition? And the answer was no, that those building footprints that are depicted on the plat are sufficient, provide sufficient flexibility. And so we were willing to accept that more onerous standard imposed by the condition than imposed by the code.
One more, may I ask one more question, please? What are the expected price ranges of the houses going to be?
I have no idea. At this point in time, it's hard to know what the market's going to be, and the cost of building materials is changing by the month by percentages that are unfathomable. So what the end market price will be is really difficult to predict at this point. And
Could I have a range? I mean, 200, 500?
I think that's a fair range. It's a pretty big one. I just honestly couldn't. I'm not fortunately, I have not had to be in the home market for a real estate home recently. So I'm not sure what square footages are going to, but I think homes are currently selling between $200 and $300 a foot all in. And if you're looking at a 2,000 square foot home, you'd be looking at $400,000 to $600,000.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Kopcho.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Mark, Mark, I guess. The question I have is around the TPR, and I know that the proposal is a limited land use decision being put forward, but the initial application did discuss the site, once it's developed, will provide bicycle and pedestrian facilities on site to encourage people to walk and reduce vehicle trips. And thinking in terms of the environmental impact and the I appreciate Commissioner Schweikart's way of putting it, the attempt to minimize kind of the impact to the area. Can you or Mr. Grenz maybe speak a little bit more? What is additional bicycle and pedestrian facilities on site? What is that? Sidewalks? Is that?
Mark Grenz?
Yeah, so we're providing a pedestrian connection between this project and the project to the north, so that to limit the out of direction travel that vehicular traffic might need to be in order to connect those two neighborhoods. And then that allows that take place. We will be making improvements along Dokes Ferry, at least along our frontage, and building a minor arterial section there that would provide bike lanes and pedestrian travel there that will facilitate along our frontage to get that done. And then that way, in conjunction with other developments that will likely take place either on this side of Dokes Ferry or the other side, that there'll be a way for pedestrian connections to be continued southerly towards the high school. So I think that's what we were talking about. I don't know of anything else that we're proposing to do in there that would be unique anyway.
Sure. No, I appreciate the clarification. The language is just a bit vague or ambiguous, so I wanted to make sure that it was clear. Thanks.
I'd like to say it was written by an attorney, but I doubt that was the case. So if it was, then there'd be justification for it being vague. So.
And Shelby, I think you caught that. That's Mr. Grenz talking for your note.
I'm sorry about that. I didn't do. And if
That's
I could,
okay.
while I have the opportunity, I wanted to correct my head shaking relative to the environmental assessment. I was incorrect. My clients have informed me through text message that they have just completed that environmental assessment was just completed, and the results were 0 contaminations on the site.
Thank you, Mr. Grenz. Did you get that, Commissioner Pollack? Yep, you did. Perfect. Any other questions for either Mr. Hoyt or Mr. Grenz? There'll be another opportunity for rebuttal at the end. So we'll move on to the first appellant. I have Steve Anderson representing West Salem Neighborhood Association. Steve, you have 15 minutes.
I'd like to share my screen if possible. Before we start this, can I just go ahead and share the screen?
Sure. Yeah. Do you know how to do that?
I will see if this comes up.
Not that I can help you, but Shelby could.
Shelby did earlier today, so.
You got it.
So Steve Anderson, Land Use Chair, West Salem Neighborhood Association, Ward 8. Neighborhood Association is requesting that because the burden of proof has not been met, the Planning Commission not approve this project currently as conditioned. Burden of proof has not been met in terms of Goal 5 protection, riparian corridors, wetlands, and habitat, insufficient data. Goal 7, reducing risk to people in natural hazard areas. These lots are sited in a landslide area. Several of them are. Brook is a high landslide area. Recommendations presented in their do not address the issue of high frequency and severity of the hazard. That has not been even looked at. There's no data to support what that will happen. And the staff has declared the site geologically stable, and the data in the applicant's geologic reports proves that false. Herbicides and pesticides on the site are unknown. As just stated, that phase 1 has not been available for public review and comment. Currently, DEQ guidance for evaluation of pesticides has a guidance document that is required to be followed for this assessment. We are unsure if that's been done. Bryce Bishop before the Planning Commission on June 1st testified that the city currently is not in compliance with Goal 5, even with their vegetation ordinances. This affects directly the riparian corridors, fish habitat, wetlands, and wildlife habitat. If you look at OAR Division 46, it states that medium and large cities have not adopted the land use regulations before to OAR 660, 2390, which deals with riparian corridors. The setback must be 100 feet for middle housing development and residential development. OAR dealing with riparian corridors talks about no compliance with inventory survey work toward this. So if the city has not done the survey and inventory work, which has not happened, LDS commissioners require a 100-foot setback, period. Willard Brook is a headwater urban cold water salmonid stream. It is a significant Goal 5 resource per the information in the record. At best, if you look at OAR 660-90, it requires in any of the two methods approved that the riparian setback can be no less than 50 feet. No incursion into that setback per that existing law. Building lots 6, 7, 8, 9, and 12 encroach. All conditions and development activities that allow encroachment within the 50-foot riparian corridor are null and void because of OAR 660. Non-compliance issue with wetlands and sensitive resources. The applicant drainage reports that there are no wetlands and sensitive areas on the site. That was a false statement. City staff has not surveyed this site yet. In fact, they're trying to put 2 representatives on the site as we speak to do that work. Section 808 requires knowledge of these sensitive resources approved by the applicant by the Public Works Administrator before further findings. This condition to pass it off to DSL as in proposed in condition 12 takes the land use goal 1 resource guarantees away from the public and circumvents public participation. We have no opportunity to come on this findings. It's not in compliance with the city subdivision code. All of this in condition 12 does not comply. If you look at the Dogami maps for this area, it shows that Willard Brook is a high risk area. The siting of 4 or 5 lot plots in this area is siting deliberately in a landslide hazard. The site is geologically stable is false. That statement by staff is false. There's data presented in the hazard report that says that this area has not been surveyed and should be looked at. Applicants experts confirms no goal 7 or 8, 10 compliance. These are the sites proposed where the sampling was done. It's all done in the upland area on what is identified as stable alluvial soils in their drainage report. This area of Willard Brook and all of the steep embankment was not sampled at all. So to say that the site is stable is false. The facts do not report that declaration. Their Redmond report says, quote, "We repeat that it would be prudent to conduct geotechnical investigations of any infrastructure or structures that require deep fill, high cuts, and proximity to Willard Brook." That was not done. They also said that the steepest slopes are at the 60% grade along Willard Brook, and locally tilted streams and banks show the potential for slope failure and the steepness of the slide or any man-made cuts. Therefore, any action in this riparian corridor and siting could cause landslide hazards and cause problems to the help. This red area will be testified to in the watershed council, but that area is not served by the watershed basin, catchment basin, but it is all going to Willard Brook without any kind of treatment. Drainage report reports 500+ increase in site runoff after development. The stormwater events and impact energy from Willard Brook on bank stability has not been addressed. Stormwater sedimentation impacts to Willard Brook has not been addressed. There's no facts in the record to support any findings there. DEQ advises on toxic chemicals that there should be a phase 1 assessment. This fact was not disclosed by the city. DEQ had a personal conversation with the city, talked with them, and they advised them that they should require a phase 1 assessment before proceeding to avoid liability and make sure that there's no questions in this site. Any findings on conditions of public health and safety are unsupportable in the record. We provided the guidance and this information prior to this case. Toxic exposure to airborne particles at grading will be exposed to the kids that live and work around the elementary school. The public health and safety standard is not met. There's no data to support that sedimentation grading activities will not expose children to toxic levels of chemicals. Stormwater basin collection system. There's no data of findings that the level of contamination that stormwater overflow basin will not contribute to pollution. City has provisions for adding additional treatment quality, but they cannot say that that is not needed because they have not investigated the chemical contamination at the site. At a minimum, a phase 1 study is required. That information should be disclosed to the public and perhaps for comment and peer review, not just accepted on somebody's hearsay, as we've had today. That's all hearsay information as of today. The Clean Water Act requires, that this deterioration and the downstream salmon house trap has to be addressed. Willard Brook flows into a water quality limited stream. That stream is identified as salmon habitat by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and there's been no findings of fact or data to show that any disruption of sediments of building fruits in this area will not impact a downstream significant salmon habitat. Therefore, we're requesting that this not be approved by the Planning Commission as currently conditioned. The burden of proof has not been met in several areas. Reliance on findings of facts are not present in the administrator's decision, and you will have seen a preponderance evidence supporting this request by the Neighborhood Association, Fish and Wildlife, and the Watershed Council. And so we ask that this be the decision of the committee to not approve at this time because the conditions of approval have not satisfied the burden of proof. Thank you.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do is we'll take questions from Mr. Anderson from the commissioners. And then I think I'll break with normal tradition and then give us an opportunity to ask questions of staff because quite a bit has been presented. So instead of waiting for staff questions until after everybody's testified. So first of all, do we have questions for Mr. Anderson from the commissioners? Would you mind, Steve, stop sharing your screen so I can see that?
Sure, I can do that. Not a problem.
Oh, that's great. Now I can see everybody.
All right, thank you.
More control. Commissioner Schweikart.
Yes, hi. I just had one question. I saw in the staff report that the applicant had notified the neighborhood association back in August of the subdivision application, and I was wondering if the applicant had ever attended a neighborhood association meeting or had any virtual communications about this subdivision application.
I believe to my memory that they had. I think that Multitech has been very good at reaching out to the neighborhood association and sharing conversations about development, but I'd have to, 100%, I don't have that in my notes in my memory, but I believe that they have. They have a practice of doing it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, no, I was asking because I was trying to find out if some of the information that you were sharing in your remarks today had been shared with the applicant previously, if there had been a conversation with the neighborhood association and the applicant about those items.
Well, we had conversations with Multitech. We asked to be able to visit the site and were denied. And so, we wanted to follow up on some issues. And so we asked for permission to visit the site and were denied access.
Okay.
Did you have a follow-up question, Commissioner Schweikart?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any other questions of Mr. Anderson? If not, we'll move to, are there any questions of staff for clarification? I would like to, Commissioner Schweikart, followed by Commissioner Schlater, then I have one.
Yeah, I think mainly just to talk through some of the sections of OAR 660 that were cited and to, things with respect to city staff surveying the site, no less than a 50-foot riparian setback, items that came up. I'd just be happy to hear staff's opinion and response.
So regarding the setback, there's not a setback to the riparian area. We are acknowledged by the state. Our comprehensive plan is acknowledged by the state, and our code is what we get to follow. There's not a setback. So we have removal criteria for trees and vegetation that was evaluated as part of the subdivision. We don't have those standards in our code to date. Regarding the contaminated soils, again, that's a state regulation. We reprocess subdivisions pretty routinely. East Park, North Star, Fairview, I think all ended up having some sort of permit through DEQ for soil contamination. That's something that's regulated by the state and is not something that we have reviewed as part of the decision criteria for a subdivision proposal. And remind me of your third one.
So there were, well, I guess there were discussions of surveying the site. There was also mention of the geotechnical landslide hazards and stormwater collection facilities. Those things I jotted down.
Yeah, I'm not sure about surveying the site. I'm not sure. I know if we don't have staff, maybe Glenn can answer some of that, and he might be able to answer the geotech and stormwater questions also.
Yeah, Glenn Davis, Public Works staff. If I'm understanding correctly, we regulate our local codes. And so local codes, we have the landslide hazards ordinance that has a geotechnical report or geological assessment that was submitted. So we measure according to that standard. And then for stormwater, we have our Chapter 71 we review under. So I think locally, those are the ordinances we would be reviewing under. I don't know. I think that if a state level issue came up, that would come up during the wetland review for DSL or for the 1200C review for the erosion control. So I think the statewide stuff, there would be an avenue for that through those state permits.
That answers your question, Commissioner Schweikert. Okay, we'll move on to Commissioner Slater, followed by Commissioner Pollack.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, and I'm going to try and phrase the first one correctly here, so bear with me. I'm wondering, and I'm really asking this, I think, so we can get it on the public record. To what extent may the staff rely on expert opinion in determining facts? For example, if we have a certified engineer submit a finding about the landscape and landslide potential, does staff have the ability to rely on that expert opinion, or do you have an obligation to assess that and make an independent determination?
Glenn, do you want to answer that related to the geotech?
So related to the geotechnical, geological assessment, I have to look, but I believe the code gives the director authority to find a peer reviewer in certain cases if warranted. And so I'd have to look at that. I'm kind of going off of memory here. So, but it happens where there's often we'll have competing experts. So you may have the appellant might hire their own geological engineering geologist or geotechnical engineer to do a competing report. And so in those cases, yes, we'll really have two different sources to look at. But generally speaking, if there's an expert, if there's an engineer, if there's a geologist who submits a report, and then there's some neighbor who is not a professional who submits some objection, normally the professional is given precedence.
Okay, thank you.
And you had a second question, Commissioner Slater?
I do. Again, just so I understand, if I'm a member of the public and I'm seeing a developer engage in activity near a stream or in a riparian area, what is the entity responsible for making sure that the developer is in compliance with any requirements in the riparian area? Is that the city? Is it the state? I'm trying to understand really who has the obligation here to monitor that activity.
I can take a shot at that, and then Olivia may have some follow up. It kind of depends on the regulation involved. And so, for example, we have a grading ordinance, and so the grading ordinance would need to be met, and they have to have a permit. We have an erosion control ordinance that have to be met and have a permit. We might have stormwater ordinance that has permits. So really, it's related to the specific permit. But if it comes to a wetland permit, generally speaking, the wetland permitting is done through the state and federal levels, and so it really depends on the specific topic. And then I think for 808 and things like that, then Olivia can answer that.
Yeah, it would depend on what's being done. Like Glenn said, the state and federal permits would regulate the actual wetland, but for some reason, if there was removal of vegetation or trees that would violate or would be complying with 808, Chapter 808, we would get involved in that.
And if I may, just one more.
Sure.
Is a riparian area necessarily a wetland?
No. I can find that code section.
So a riparian area may not be covered by the state's wetland requirements. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's why the concurrence letter is required, right? Because they have to tell you whether or not they think it meets the criteria.
No, not all riparian areas are wetlands. That's correct.
Follow-up question, Commissioner Slater?
No, I'm trying to process this.
So to clarify, a riparian corridor is the area with a boundary measured 50 feet from a top of bank of a waterway. And then there's an extra one for the Willamette River, but so it's from a waterway, not necessarily a wetland.
Thank you. I'll pause at this point.
Okay, Commissioner Pollack.
Thank you. So I just, a couple of questions, and it actually goes to Commissioner Slater. Inquiries. Is there a competing technical report by a professional contradicting the facts of the ones submitted by the applicant?
I have not seen one.
Okay. In regards to the neighborhood association argument about the difference between 50 and 100 feet riparian zones, you just said that the current code for Salem is 50 feet. Mm-hmm. What do you say to this argument that the state requirement is 100 feet?
So our riparian corridor definition does include 100 foot for the Willamette Greenway. I think it's based on the cubic feet of stream that's going through. So it depends on the size of the river or stream or waterway.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And there was something else. So just to make clear, your condition is, I understand that there's currently, based on the testimony, that two things. One, that there's a wetland delineation that was currently being conducted. And according to the conditions, the result of that will determine how to treat whether there is or there isn't a wetland. Is that correct?
So the state would regulate if there is a wetland. So if there's a delineation that shows a wetland, they would have to get the proper permits federally and through the state for that wetland. Correct.
Okay. And the other thing is the phase one, we have testimony, not hearsay. We have a testimony by someone that says that their client has had one done and that it was negative. That is testimony. Mm-hmm. Would you be requiring a copy of the phase one, or is that not a routine requirement?
It's not a routine requirement. I'm not sure that it's part of the this regulatory process under Salem Revised Code.
Thank you much. That's it.
We'll add though that does usually come up as part of the DEQ review for the 1200C when they get into the erosion control review.
Yeah, the DEQ, but not for you.
Locally, not locally.
Okay, thank you.
Great. I think asking the questions at that point helped. Let's move on to the second appellant, Mr. Byerly. You also have 15 minutes. And if you're going to share a screen, do you need any help with that?
I think not.
You got it. So you have 15 minutes. So a name and address for the record, please.
For the record, my name is Ken Beerley. I live on 2308 Ptarmigan Street in West Salem, Ward 8, and I'm chair of the Glen Gibson Creek Watershed Council. My comments tonight, one, I'd like to recognize that there have been adjustments to the subdivision plan that tried to address some of the concerns about the conditions of the site. And the focus of the Watershed Council is on the health of the watersheds of West Salem and how their appropriate protection might be applied. One of the issues has to do with specific wording of the findings in the order, and that is that they basically said that they're in a local wetlands inventory. The local wetlands inventory, as shown in this map, did not include the property site. The property was likely not within the city limits at the time that the inventory was done in 1999. So the fact that a wetland delineation is occurring is really important information. Having been on the site, it's clear to me that there are wetlands on the site. The primary issue that we want to raise is that all of the waterways have not been identified. There are two tributaries, one that would be impacted and one, as the applicant has stated, would not be inventoried. But I think it's important to understand that these were recognized in the Geologic Hazards Report. Both tributaries were identified in the Geologic Hazards Report that the applicant developed. And in personal observation, those has stream flow. They appear to flow from springs. And the issue of land stability, I think, is important. The sampling, 4 to 6 foot deep sample holes, were all done on the relatively flat, and that's relative, portion of the property, the buildable portion of the property. But within the first foot and a half, they found a model layer which indicate that that area is saturated at least on a regular basis. There were no samples that were any closer than 100 or 200 feet from the Riparian Corridor or the tributaries. And I'm going to go back to this, and that is that the Geologic Hazard Assessment used the same samples, but they also looked at the slope stability. And quoting from their report, the steepest slopes are up to 60% along Willark Brook and its tributary. They were specifically looking at slope stability as it relates to not just Willark Brook, but Willark Brook and tributaries, and identified those conditions that would be adversely, that could be subject to a landslide failure. And so those areas, as shown on the LiDAR map here, particularly this drainage here, which is quite deep, would have unstable side slopes. So we believe that the information submitted by the applicant shows that there are unstable conditions on a portion of the development site that have not been fully addressed by either the city or the applicant. We make the case, try to make the case that this stream is important for wildlife, but particularly cutthroat trout, native trout in the area. They were the only inventory information we could find was 1999 inventory by Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. And our argument is that altering the tributaries, allowing the tributaries to be altered, will have an adverse effect on the stream itself mostly by increasing temperatures. And the site plan supporting documents don't address all the streams in the property. And the Geologic Hazard Reports shows, I mean, the development plan shows building lots over the top of one of the tributaries. So there'd likely be fill in this tributary system. And while the Department of State Lands And Army Corps of Engineers regulates the placement of fill, and state regulates the removal of material from waters of the state. This could require a permit for the development of this building lot. The point is that that's not planning, that's a regulatory process separate from planning. So if you're planning to make an impact, this is one way to do it. The other concern we have is that the information about the stability of the property has been cherry-picked to generalize about the general stability of the upland portion, and it tends to not look at the concerns about instability associated with the steep portion of the property. The findings in there's also an interesting finding in the compliance with the tree conservation plan that basically says no removal of vegetation, and then the finding is that there will be no removal, but yet there's a permit for removal. I don't think both can be true at the same time. Our greatest concern of the lots that were shown that encroach upon the riparian zone is that, for one thing, there is between 16 and 20 foot difference in elevation from one corner of the lot to the other. To me, that means that if you're going to build a lot close to the street, you're going to have to fill significantly, and you're filling at the edge of a steep slope. So those are that, and one of the specific concerns addressed in the Geologic Hazards Report was a concern about placing fill on steep slopes. And for example, this lot, I believe there's at least 16 feet of elevational difference across that. If you have fill, you're filling onto this slope. You can tell by the confluence of the contour lines that in fact that's relatively steep slope. That lot, so you've got you're hyper loading a slope that is unstable. Using the local wetlands inventory, I think one of the issues is that you're basically deferring decisions about property development to another entity, and that's really not the purpose of planning. Planning is to try to figure out how you can address the issues that that the city is concerned with. One of the concerns that raised early in the process was concern about the stormwater detention facility. There's been good feedback that helped me understand that, in fact, the way they determined soil infiltration was important. But I think it's important to know that this design that was in the preliminary drainage plan showed that this entire area would be drained directly to Willark Brook. With the redesign of the facility, this is not the design that's being considered. This is a previous design of the layout. This road now comes across here in some location, and there's a stub street that comes down to service these lots. So there's quite likely an area, some undefined area here, again, that would drain directly to Willark Brook, not to this stormwater detention facility. This has, to my knowledge, there is not an evaluation of the effects of the just changed layout on the runoff from this property. And we'll ignore the stuff from this side because that's not yet proposed for development, but there is a significant area on the north side that would drain towards Willark Brook that hasn't been analyzed because of the use of the previous layout for the original analysis of the stormwater detention facility. We recognize that the city has a positive responsibility to identify the waterways, that the waterways are those that are identified by the director. We recognize that in lieu of not having complete information, they use the National Wetlands Inventory, which is a nationwide, broad, very broad scale. That's why you only identify Willark Brook, not the tributaries. We believe, and in communication with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, that protection of the tributaries is equally important to protection of the brook itself. We believe that there should be consideration for protection for, if you're going to agree that protection of cold water fish species is important, we need to protect the tributaries as well as the main stem of Willark Brook. And we believe that there is potential for local slope failures on the steepest site slopes from 4 or 5 of the lots. And these are the lots that we're the building sites that we're particularly concerned about. There would be significant fill associated with both the layout of this road, this home structure. These would all be structures that would have to be filled towards this tributary system. And again, the development of the lots 8, 9, and 12 encroach into the riparian area, but also because of the topography would likely require significant fill that could over steepen those slopes and could result in slope failure. So our recommendation is to work with the applicant to conduct wetlands inventory. It sounds like that's being done. We're looking forward to that, but we'd like to have the opportunity to review that prior to approval of the application, and require the applicant to look very closely at the impact of the structures on the slopes associated with Willark Brook, and particularly the one tributary that drains from the Dokes Ferry Road area, and require the configuration of building envelopes to avoid any impact to the riparian area, because the permanent encroachment into the riparian area is it cuts against the intention of the Salem's revised code. And we would work with them. We also want to make sure that the stormwater design plan, the stormwater design plan accurately reflects the current configuration and layout, so that we know what's how much of the property would actually be draining to the stormwater detention facility, and how much would be drained directly to Willark Brook. And we want to make sure that the findings reflect the conditions of the property. We're concerned that there is, by the revised design, there's going to be more drainage directly to Willark Brook rather than through the stormwater detention facility. Our experience in West Salem, and particularly we will talk about Goldcrest Brook, because that is a tributary to Glen Creek, very close to and very similar to Willark Brook. We recognize that the city has made significant design standards, but we want to make sure that the protections are sufficiently robust to ensure that the conditions of Willark Brook don't get to the conditions of Goldcrest Brook. And
Mr. Beerley, are you wrapping up because you are
I
at your
am.
2 minutes? Thank you.
Okay. The findings from Crest Brook are the need to allow the streams to adjust to their conditions and allow easier access for mitigation. With that, I'll stop sharing and
Thank you.
be
Thank
glad
you.
to answer any questions.
Great. We've got Commissioner Pollock.
Yes, I wanted to ask, thank you very much for that presentation. It was very informative and all your written stuff as well. What do you say to the testimony by the attorney representing the applicant that the standards that were used in the Gold Crest and the ones now, for the current project, that the ones now are more stringent than the ones for Gold Crest? What do you say to that testimony?
What I just said was that it's well recognized that the standards have improved.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that the standards are perfect or recognize all the conditions of the property. We think that there ought to be recognition of all of the conditions of the property when they're developing a proposal.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Slater.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first is you said that your primary concern was increasing temperatures for the salmon habitat. But when I look at the tree preservation plan, it looks like there are very few trees removed. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Yes, the threat of change is related to the tributaries. If the tributaries lose, and the development is proposing to affect at least the south side of the tributary of one of the tributaries, which would increase heating, which would increase the temperature of Willark Brook. So it's more concern. We recognize that the riparian protections provided will provide protection to this Willark Brook itself, but most heating from for streams comes from tributary discharge. So if you get warm discharge, you have warm streams. If you have cold discharge, you keep the temperature in the stream at a low temperature.
My second question, if I may,
Yes,
is can you help me understand what the relationship is between your concern about slope stability and the health of the tributary?
If you oversteepen a slope and you get slope failure, you get fine sediment into the stream, you get undercut banks, you get increased erosion, and you could unravel the stream channel itself.
Thank you.
Mr. Beerley, I have one question related to that slope steepness. Do builders have a way of mitigating that potential when they're dealing with the slope? And maybe
I presume that they could, yes.
Okay.
But there was no finding or showing that there was consideration for that.
Okay, maybe we'll get the applicant to address that in their rebuttal. Any other questions of Mr. Beerley at this time? Thank you, Ken.
Thank you very much.
Any questions of staff related to around the comments that Mr. Beerley shared that we want to ask staff? Commissioner Slater.
Yeah, thank you. I guess my main question here is that the Watershed Council has identified a tributary. They're calling it Tributary A, I think, or maybe it's B. And it seems like the applicant has acknowledged that, but I'm wondering what staff has, if staff has something they would like to add about that. That seems to me like a significant factor that was not addressed in the application or in the decision-making process.
So I think that it was addressed in the decision-making process when we required the DSL delineation to be done, as it would be a wetland. If it's delineated as a wetland, it would be treated as a wetland, be permitted through the state. If it was determined at some point that it was a waterway, then we would probably be back looking at a modification to the subdivision for the trees in the area or the vegetation in the area if it was determined as a waterway. At this point, we don't have any evidence that it's a waterway. Maybe Glenn can help me out here. But right now we're basing it off the information that we have, and it's according to our maps. Am I right? Correct, Glenn? The only waterway we have is the Brook.
Yeah, of all the materials that the city has with our master planning and all that, it speaks to Willock Brook being the only waterway. There's always tributaries to every waterway that have riparian effects, but the regulation applies only to Willock Brook, is our staff's opinion. But yeah, if there's a wetland, that would be addressed through the wetland process, and then if the wetland work was limited, then that would affect a couple of those lots.
We have testimony now and photographs of a spring and a tributary, and the Watershed Council believes there's a tributary, and it seems like the applicant acknowledges that. So what's this? So right now the staff's view is that we don't have any information on that, or we don't have credible information, or it's just new information. I mean, how do you process that fact, I guess, is what I'm asking, because it looks like lot 8, they're putting a building on top of a waterway or a potential wetland. And I'm trying to understand how we deal with that.
I'll start, and then Olivia can wrap up here. But I would say personally, there's 3 different regulations that I would emphasize with that particular lot. One would be the wetlands. And so the wetlands isn't determined yet until we get back to the delineation and to the DSL process. So the state and federal process will decide if it's a wetland, and if so, if there's restrictions. The second part is the geotechnical report that has some information about these tributaries. And so when the grading is done, the engineer who is involved in the grading will need to consult that geotechnical report, consult the geotechnical engineer, and confirm that that is done in a way that's stable. And then the third thing is the Riparian Corridor in Chapter 808. And as it stands now, staff's opinion is it is not a waterway that is subject to Chapter 808, and therefore does not have a riparian setback. And that's something that I don't believe would change after this decision. So Olivia, does that cover what you think of?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Schweikart.
So building off of Commissioner Slater's question, so just walking through the potential future steps here. DSL has their chance to weigh in, Army Corps has their chance to weigh in. And if either one of them came back and said that in our assessment, these tributaries are considered protected because they are considered perennial streams, or whatever identification that they use to determine that they have regulatory authority over those tributaries for protection purposes, then basically the regardless of whether there is a current subdivision approval in place, the applicant would have to come back and revise the existing subdivision plan, and they would have to resubmit a revised application to meet the requirements of the tributary, the wetland delineation of those tributaries.
That's correct, and I would say this just happened for the Salem Business Campus. They had an approval that they did a wetland delineation later and discovered that some of the property was not developable and had to come back and amend it. And so there was a modification they had to do. So that's pretty common when those delineations are done. That's just part of the process that's to my knowledge quite common.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions of staff at this time? We'll have another opportunity. Commissioner Pollack.
On the drainage report submitted by Multitech on page 2, it says stormwater quality analysis. And on the, I think it's the second sentence, it says the remaining 2.74 acres drains naturally to Willock Brook and cannot be directed to the facilities because of significant grade differentials. It is proposed that all driveways that will serve the 3 lots be constructed of pervious concrete. It is requested that stormwater management for the 3 residential be designed via simplified approach, and the calculations below assume the request has been granted for the development. That means that the people that buy these homes are going to have pervious driveways that they have to take care of differently than regular concrete. Because my understanding of pervious, because of my research into it for my purposes, is that you can't power wash these things. The whole idea of it being pervious is that there's air bubbles, there's no sand in the mix. There's like kind of space open so that the water can drain. And if you power wash it or you don't take care of it, that sort of negates the whole idea of it being pervious. Is there any conditions that are going to be put on these pieces of property that would talk to the fact that they have to maintain these pervious concretes in a way that they function, the infiltration functions properly? The reason why I say this is because of my experience in here, we have one of those little stormwater rivers that go through our backyard, and the back lot was ordered to have a sump pump put in there. And as soon as the guy bought it, he basically yanked the sump pump out of there and didn't, and all that. The builder put the sump pump to help with the drainage and everything, and the new owner just yanked it all out. So if we're going to use this as a resolution to prevent like mass stormwater runoff into the storm drains to help with, natural infiltration, is there something condition that we can put that makes sure that this pervious concrete is going to work the way it's supposed to for the long run?
I'll try to give this kind of a multifaceted answer here. First part of the answer is that the design standards place a preference on having combined facilities that the city maintains to make that kind of accountability easier, so that we're not relying so much on individual homeowners maintaining individual lot by lot facilities, but instead we have combined facilities. So that is the preference. That's the expectation for developments when they can do that. And so that is the first line of defense from that problem. But there's times where that the lot by lot is the only option available, and so that is it's allowed. And normally we have what's called a private stormwater facilities agreement, PSFA, that we will enter into with the homeowner to give us authority to go on the property, to inspect the facilities. That's very common for these, so that we, the city, have the right to make sure they're maintained and operating correctly. And then as part of our MS4 permit with the state, we have a commitment to frequency of inspections and compliance and things like that. So it is something the city does regulate. It is something we follow up on. We don't just ignore it. But it is not our preference. If possible, we would like to have them be combined. And so, Mark, I believe that the design engineer is going to be, as much as he can, putting them into common facilities. But if it's just not topographically possible, then he would then have probably a few individual facilities on each lot. And because the standard of the code is not to increase the flows, and so they need to treat treat the flows however they can. So
are you asking for confirmation from Mr. Grins, Glenn, on that?
That'll be helpful, yeah.
Okay. Mr. Grins, would you like to state on the record your response?
We would be, since the stage we're at here is the preliminary design, we have a preliminary stormwater management report, so we haven't done the final analysis, but as we go through that, Glenn is correct. So the intention here is to utilize the stormwater facility that we have set out on the project to accommodate both detention and treatment for the for the vast majority of the site, but it is likely that we will have to use other minor facilities in order to achieve the treatment that's necessary if we can't direct it all to the stormwater facility that's there. Now, the one key thing here is that at the downstream end of this project, when the amount of water that this project is allowed to discharge into Willark Brook is going to be based on the pre-developed conditions for this site. So even if we can't capture everything and get it into the detention basin or treatment facility and we treat it, we still have to accommodate the amount of water that's allowed to leave the site to pre-developed conditions. So we would have to do over detention and stuff in our facility. So that'll all be worked out when we go through the next round of design and plan review and report review that goes to the Public Works, and they're pretty good about making sure that the second time we go through that they get another bite at us. So we'll be sure to comply with that.
So Commissioner, before I come to you, Commissioner Heller, Commissioner Pollack, is your hand raised as a follow-up to that line of questioning? Or did you have a
yes.
Okay, go ahead then, please.
Okay, so yes, I do understand the goal is pre-development stormwater runoff. That's the goal. So if the pervious concrete is part of that goal on this 2.74 acres that isn't possible to put into your facilities, whose responsibility will it be to ensure that those agreements that Glenn was talking about with the individual owners will be done? Is it the developer or is it the city?
Well, the process that has been in existence since the code was revised that we've been utilizing is that these agreements are entered into between the city and the landowner, in this case the developer, or they'll be with the builder if it's a specific site specific design is done, and that those agreements make the property owner responsible for complying with the terms and provisions of the design that's in place. So if they don't, then the city has the right to periodically inspect and to either force them to make that change or to take responsibility and make that change and assess those costs to the property owner. So that's the process that's there. Now, I wouldn't be fearful of pervious concrete, and I know you've done some research in it and stuff, but our experience would say that pervious concrete as it is produced today has capacities far in excess of what we're allowed to use in our design parameters. So it takes an awful lot of degradation for that pervious concrete to not function as it's intended to. And there are maintenance requirements that we put out when we use pervious concrete in a design. There are operations O&M manual type criteria that we put out that talk about what the responsibilities that the property owner has and what types of maintenance activities should be taking place in order to prevent the degradation from occurring prematurely.
Oh, thank you. And you're right. It's a really great tool for infiltration, especially if the goal is pre-development. I'm not against it. I'm just like worrying about long range. And thank you very much, both of you, because that answers my question.
Thank you. Commissioner Heller, you've been so patient.
Thank you. I'm curious about the difference in the appellant and the applicant as far as landslides are concerned. And could somebody educate me about why there's such a difference, or did you use some other method that the appellant didn't use, or help me out and explain to me why there's such a huge gap?
Well, let me start out by saying that as representing the applicant, we hired a geotechnical consultant, and they brought in a geological consultant on it that we've worked with for over 40 years. So we have a lot of respect for this particular firm and the people that's involved there.
Mhm.
The appellants did not use an expert. They don't have an expert in their stuff. So they're gleaning their information off of the information that they can get from
Mr.
different.
Grenz, we probably need to hold your comments for rebuttal time because I think the questions right now, my understanding, are for staff. They may turn to you for clarification.
Okay.
But hold that thought, and then staff, would you like to respond to Commissioner Heller's question about understanding the disparity in opinion about the land size? Olivia?
I was going to let Glenn answer that question. He's the expert.
I was giving him a break.
No, that's fine. It's not so mysterious. I mean, there's a difference of opinion here, and the applicant has a geotechnical professional who has given some opinions. And one thing that may or may not be understood is that there's a report. We receive it, we file it, and then when the development moves along, they're going to come in and get permits to move dirt, and through Chapter 82 of our code, and that we pull that report back out, and we review it. We have the design engineer review it and making sure that they've met those requirements. So it's not like this thing gets put on a shelf and forgotten. It is something that's used. And so I think much of the appellant's concern may be that it might get shelved and forgotten, and that's not the case. But if there's just an honest disagreement, we would certainly give preference to the professional who's certified, and not to just a different opinion.
Okay, so may I follow up?
Yeah.
So you don't do anything independently. You just is that correct? As far as studying this, you take the expert's opinion, or if there were two experts, you take both of those. But you don't. But the city doesn't do anything independently. Is that correct?
Rarely. I mean, if we really have, there have been cases where we have gone to a third party.
Okay.
In unusual cases, we didn't believe that was warranted here.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Slater.
I just wanted to respond to Commissioner Heller's question. I understood the difference between the two parties being the fact that the engineering firm sampled upland, whereas the appellants were interested in the sloped area where there had been no soil testing. So that's how I interpreted them coming to different conclusions, because I think the appellant did not say they were concerned about slides in the upland area where there had been soil testing. But again, that's just how I understood the difference.
Thank you. Any other questions at this time for staff related to the comments around Mr. Beerley's testimony? I'm not seeing any raised hands. We have 4 individuals signed up for public testimony. And as a reminder, you each will have 3 minutes, and each of you will need to state your name and address for the record when I call on you.
Sorry,
Yeah.
President Griggs, it's 5 minutes of testimony.
Is it 5? Okay.
Yeah, I think I told a couple people 3, but I reread the agenda and it is 5. So just want to clarify.
Yep, you're right. It is 5. So Mr. Easterly, you are up first. Are you with us, Mr. Easterly? Let's see if you're on. There you are.
Good evening, President Griggs, members of the Planning Commission. I'm E.M. Easterly, Ward 8. The findings issued by the Planning Administrator offer conclusions that are A, not supported by the evidence submitted, and B, do not satisfy the approval criteria described in SRC 205.010D 1 through 9, or the requirements of SRC chapters 71, 82, 808, and 810. I shall review the inadequate findings and provide written testimony highlighting the absence of stated approval criteria or supporting evidence that conforms to the hearing notice burden of proof stipulations. Area A, Chapter 71. There is no evidence provided that SRC 71.01001 objectives B and D have been or will be met by the tentatively approved subdivision. There is no evidence provided that SRC 71.015 A1B has not been violated by the tentatively approved subdivision. There is no evidence provided that SRC 71.050A discharges will be discouraged by the tentatively approved subdivision. There is no evidence provided that explains or conditions the deposition of runoff from the right-of-way serving lots 6, 7, and 8. Chapter 82. There is no evidence provided that individual lot clearing and grading permits will be required for each lot that includes a portion of the Willark Brook Riparian Corridor as stipulated in SRC 82.030A2. There is no evidence provided that SRC Chapter 82 grading permits may be issued under, quote, the least disruptive of native vegetation, unquote, requirements of SRC 808. Chapter 205, special setbacks. There are no planning administrator labeled findings which address SRC 205.010D1C. Chapter 205, least disruption of vegetation. The planning administrator's finding which address 205.010D9 contradicts staff responses relating to tentative subdivision approval conditions 10 and 11. Chapter 808, the evidence provided in the planning administrator's tentative approval document fails to confirm that the tentative approval of this subdivision conforms to the requirements of 808.030A2N3. The evidence provided in the planning administrator's record of decision, which gives tentative approval to the subdivision, contradicts the purpose statement of SRC 808.001, and in particular, State Land Use Goal 5. Chapter 810. The evidence provided in the record of decision indicates that the Redmond Geotechnical Assessment only addresses those portions of the property west of the Willark Brook Riparian Corridor. Therefore, the Redmond findings are not applicable to the riparian area. In conclusion, members of the Planning Commission, my statements and the documentation cited in my written testimony demonstrate that this project, as conditioned, does not meet either the burden of proof or the Salem subdivision approval criteria. Thank you.
Hey, you must have timed that several times because that was perfectly 5 minutes. Well done. Questions of Mr. Easterly from commissions? I do not see any hand up. Commissioner Pollock.
Thank you for being here today and your testimony. You quote the planning administrator's report. What about the staff report that was submitted since then? The in response to the appeal, it sort of goes bit by bit, and it's addressing all the issues that you're talking about. Have you? I mean, it seems to me that you're saying the planning administrator didn't address it, but since then, this subsequent staff report seems to address it. So what do you say to that?
Thank you, Commissioner Pollock. You're absolutely correct. I only had 5 minutes. I have a written document that addresses some of the points that are in that staff report that was submitted to you and fellow members of the Planning Commission. I have not yet offered up that written testimony. It's 13 pages long, and I would hope that in the conversation that pursues, that there will be a strategy and a mechanism where I can submit that additional testimony.
Thank you.
Paul, any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Easterly. Next, we have Linda Beerley. And a name and address, please, for the record, and again, 5 minutes. There, we see you.
Okay. Good evening, Chair Griggs and members of the Planning Commission. I am Linda Beerley, and I reside in Ward 8. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about the appeal of this decision to approve the subdivision. To comply with SRC 205030, the subdivision application should not be approved until the stream map and wetland delineation are completed and included in the plan, and the layout has been changed to protect the two tributaries of Willark Brook, their riparian corridors, and the wetlands. It seems like there's some dispute about whether these are really waterways. These are waterways. I have waded in them, and this is a drought year. I'd like to switch now to the study about Goldcrest Brook, and that's why I put the graphic up. This is one of the slides in that study, and it shows us what happens to waterways when there's more water all of a sudden added to them. It informs us about stream action. A week ago, the Glen and Gibson Creeks Watershed Council and residents of Goldcrest Brook were invited to a workshop about the restoration of Goldcrest Brook. Goldcrest Brook has washed away trees and backyards, and it's threatening structures. City staff and consultants have spent the past 2 years studying the stream, how it got to this point, and how to remedy the problems. The fix will be difficult and costly. This study underscores the importance of prevention. Goldcrest Brook and Willark Brook share many characteristics. They are both high gradient streams, meaning a big drop in elevation from the headwaters to the mouth of the stream. Runoff in these streams is fast and forceful. During high rainfall events, scour and erosion occur. The Willark Brook watershed is steeper, so runoff will travel faster and have more power. Many of the lots proposed will pipe stormwater directly into Willark Brook, increasing scour and erosion. All streams are dynamic. Existing conditions inform us of future condition. In the case of Willark Brook and the two tributaries that are not yet mapped, the banks are steep and high. In some places, the banks are 36 feet high. It is important to understand that this is a work in progress. Willark Brook is not done yet. These banks will get higher and the stream bed will get wider. Willark Brook has accomplished this on its own so far, with little drainage from impervious surfaces high in the drainage. The only significant impervious surfaces upstream of the subject property is the northern half of West Salem High School. As the watershed develops and more impervious surface is added, we can be sure of one thing: these gulches will get deeper and wider. It is true that the management of stormwater in Salem has evolved. Detention basins have greater capacity, and they are designed to filter as well as retain stormwater. But in times of heavy rainfall, the best designed systems are overwhelmed. Gutters and streets fill up and overflow into streams. Streams run high and fast. It is during these events that scouring and bank erosion occur. We have all lived through these events in Salem. They are not uncommon, and climate scientists tell us we can expect more of them. Thinking about this process is important because this development places homes and infrastructure on the brink of high and steep banks that will be shaped by the force of water. The Goldcrest Brook story ought to be our teachable moment. Staff and consultants tell us how important it is to learn about Goldcrest Brook and how to prevent the situation because it is so difficult to fix the damage later. At the recent workshop, residents of Goldcrest Brook asked the following questions. Can the bank erosion be stopped? How much will it cost? Who will pay? As you make your decision about this appeal, I ask you to think about the consequences of allowing this development to proceed and to think about the Goldcrest Brook study as you make your decision. I have asked that the 2 documents about the Goldcrest Brook study be put into the record. Please look through the PowerPoint and watch the video. They are well worth your time and they will help you reach a decision. I would also like to ask that you delay your decision until a determination has been made about Tributary A. I know it's a waterway, but I think that you should wait on this approval or whether you decide to deny it or not until that is determined. Because if it is a waterway, it will have a riparian corridor to be protected, as with Tributary B. There's no development proposed for Tributary B, but it still doesn't have an official riparian corridor. And that is important. And I thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions of Ms. Beerley? Using the raise the hand. And would you mind unsharing your screen?
I'm trying to figure out how to do that. Hang on.
Well, I'm impressed that you can share the screen. I just have to tell you that. Commissioner
I got it.
Schweikart.
Thank you, Linda, for your comments. Because you were so focused on that one issue, I did want to ask the question of, with response to the wetland delineation. So the condition number 12 has been recommended to be revised to explicitly state the submission of a wetland delineation to the Department of State Lands to obtain concurrence. And so is there a reason why that action, that condition doesn't provide the, I guess, the needed clarification of whether or not protections are going to be mandated and therefore will decide how the design moves forward?
2 things. First of all, there's no public process. We, if you make your decision before that report is submitted, there's no way we have to challenge that. And second, DSL provides a process. They don't protect wetlands. So if there is a determination that there is a wetland, it can be filled. You just have to go through a permit process. So I just like to make sure that it's recognized that they are waterways and they have a riparian corridor.
Thank you.
Other questions of Ms. Beerley? Not seeing any. Thank you, Ms. Beerley.
Thank
Linda,
you.
You betcha. Next, we have Sarah Campos. Again, name and address for the record, and you have until 7:28.
Good evening. My name is Sarah Campos. I live at 1647 Goldcrest. I've owned property along the Goldcrest Brook for the last 7 years. While I've been fortunate to only lose a few inches of my property, I've seen my neighbors lose several feet. Last week, I attended a presentation by City of Salem Public Works that discussed the results of a study of the Goldcrest Brook and possible restoration strategies. While the group had some interesting ideas, I'm sad to see public money being spent to fix a preventable problem. I'm afraid the city is heading down the same path with the plan affecting the Willark Brook. Goldcrest and Willark Brooks have similar characteristics. I would hate to see residents along Willark Brook suffer like those of us along Goldcrest have. That is building houses too close to the brook. I would also be disappointed if the city had to spend money fixing a problem it had the research and foresight to prevent. Please consider learning from past mistakes when forming your decision on this appeal. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions of Ms. Campos? Yeah, I'm not seeing any hands raised. Thank you for your verbal and your written testimony. Last, we have Nikki Varney. name and address, please, for the record, and you have 7:29-ish.
Here we go. Thank you. Good evening, President Griggs and members of the Planning Commission. My name is Mickey Varney, and I live at 1976 Turnage Street, Northwest in West Salem. I have been a salmon biologist for the past 30 years. I'm testifying today to express my concerns about the current plans for the proposed subdivision at 2230 Dokesbury Road Northwest. I am concerned about the removal of so many trees, the disruption to the Riparian Corridor along Willard Brook, and the potential chemical and silt runoff from steep slopes. I'm concerned about the potential impacts to native fish, aquatic insects, and native vegetation. Furthermore, I do believe the tentatively approved subdivision will alter the flow and temperature in Willard Brook. I want to stress, I am not anti-development. I understand that growth and development will continue to occur within the UGB. However, I want us to be proactive in our decision-making with a focus on smart and ecologically sound development. Years ago, my ex-husband decided to selectively log a 15-acre parcel of mountain forest land. The wooded property had gentle slopes and included a small spring-fed pond. After the property was logged, the pond disappeared. Despite our restoration efforts, we were never able to get it back. I say all this because actions have consequences, and unanticipated or unaccounted for consequences can have wide-ranging and irreversible impacts. Trees and vegetation serving as stream buffers preserve groundwater, keep water temperatures cooler, and moderate temperature extremes. Salmonids need cool water and sufficient food and oxygen to survive. The warmer the water temperature, the lower the dissolved oxygen the water can hold, and the higher the fish's metabolic rate. High temperatures increase stress levels through a physiological and biochemical restructuring of a fish's cellular components. Fish are poikilotherms. Their body temperature is dependent on the water around them. The only way they can change their body temperature is to physically swim to cooler areas. This often results in upstream migrations into the cooler headwaters of streams. As our climate warms, the importance of cold water refugia for fish and other aquatic inhabitants becomes accelerated. As the size and number of these important areas decrease, crowding and competition among salmonids causes additional stress on our native fish. A salmonid of importance to this discussion is the steelhead. After they hatch, juvenile steelhead spend 1 to 4 years rearing in fresh water before migrating to the ocean. They utilize smaller streams for this rearing period and will actively migrate upstream as water temperatures warm during the summer months. Our Willamette winter steelhead are listed under the ESA as a threatened population, and they comprise an evolutionary significant unit. The Willamette ESU, which that is, includes all the wild winter steelhead in the Willamette River and its tributaries, from Willamette Falls to the mouth of Calapooya Creek. Willard Brook, Gibson, and Glen Creeks are all components of this ESU. In closing, the impacts of a warming climate on our environment and on our future are real. Let's be proactive in our land use practices and decisions. It's up to us to make decisions which will have the least impact on the ecosystem and to give our native fish a fighting chance. That concludes my testimony, and I'm willing to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Varney. Questions for Ms. Varney? I am not seeing any, so thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
And that is all that I have on my list. Did anybody else wish to testify on this appeal?
I didn't have any additional signups.
Okay, great. So we'll move to questions of staff. Commissioner Copcho.
Yes, my question relates tangentially to what Ms. Varney was just talking about with respect to salmonids. I'm curious if staff is aware of the District Court Judge Hernandez's issue on July 16 to the Army Corps of Engineers regarding the waterways in Willamette Valley and throughout Oregon that will impact salmonid populations. And I wonder if there's any implication to, the connecting waterways as it relates to this area. It's very recent, so.
Yeah, I will say I'm not aware of that specific issue. Normally speaking, those types of things come to Salem through the MS4 permitting process that is done through DEQ. And I think we're right now awaiting our most recent permit from them. So that's normally where those get implemented.
Did you have a follow-up, Commissioner Kopcho?
I do not.
Okay, Commissioner
Chair Griggs, I think that the applicant has rebuttal.
I was going to get to him in just a second after I get staff questions. Commissioner Schweikart, followed by Slater.
Thank you. I want to come back to in the original decision on page 16, where it talks about the impact to the riparian corridor area by the lots 8, 9, 12, and 13. Because I think what I'm trying to understand is that we have these building footprint areas, and I'm trying to understand if there are any requirements with respect to the disturbance to a larger perimeter than just the building footprint through the course of construction, because I think that anyone who has been to a construction site knows that you're not just utilizing the space that you're putting your building pad on, that you're pouring your foundation and you're building the structure on. You're utilizing a much larger space for a variety of activities, including staging the materials where your equipment's going to sit to be able to build upon that building area. So the fact that only 2.5% of the total riparian area falls within the building footprints for those lots, that is one statistic. But then I'm thinking about the reality of the impacts of the construction process, and so I'm trying to understand what the requirements are for limiting that within a riparian corridor.
There's not a specific regulation in Chapter 808 for that, because like I said, there's not a setback. I did hear, I think the applicant state that when they looked at condition 11 that said no construction activities or grading can happen outside of that building envelope, that they decided to go along with that condition because they could make it work with the grading or the push out. So the houses will probably be smaller than that building envelope. So I think the applicant could probably address that in rebuttal, but that any construction activity would be contained within that building envelope.
Answer your question, Commissioner Schweikart?
Yes, thanks.
You're good. Commissioner Slater.
Thank you. Just very quickly, Olivia or Glenn, whoever can answer this. If there's a wetland that's determined to be there, does that then prohibit any construction or impact, or does it just then create a regulatory process where you have to file an application and then can do work in that area?
This is Glenn. Generally, if you want to put fill in a wetland, that requires a wetland fill permit through DSL and often through the Corps. And so, yeah, it is. If there's a wetland, there are mechanisms. I think Ms. Beerley had pointed this out as well. There are mechanisms to fill the wetland that is allowed in some cases. Sometimes mitigation is required. Sometimes it's not allowed. So yeah, that is something entirely at the state and federal levels that they would determine. But yeah, it is just because it's a wetland does not mean it's undevelopable.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move on. And there are not any other questions. I see your hand raised, Ms. Varney, but we've already moved from your testimony, so I'm afraid I can't call on you if your hand is raised for that purpose. Maybe you're just saying hi to me. I don't know. But we will move to rebuttal with the applicant, Mr. Hoyt. You have 5 minutes. I bet you're going to use it all too.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the time, and I appreciate the attention and detail and the comments that have been made by the citizenry. We share their concerns, and that's why you've seen the design that you have and the request for modifications that allow us to try and protect these resources and still develop much needed housing within the city. A couple of things I want to share with the group. And first, I will show you a screenshot that was taken from the clicking the wrong button, taken from the Glenn Gibson Watershed Council webpage. You'll see Willock Brook there, and this is an identification of the watersheds and the waterways on this particular property. And there is no question that on this property, there are geographic depressions that funnel water into Willock Brook. Those are reflected if you look at the lot grading map with the building envelopes and footprints on it. You will see that those are depicted there. And so, but they're not even on the watershed's own map of waterways reflected as a waterway. And this is a screenshot of it. If you go to their website today and look at it, as I did during the hearing, you will see that it still reflects only Willock Brook, and it does not reflect the 2 tributaries. So there's not a waterway there. There may be a wetland, and that wetland delineation may be there later through the DSL process, but it will not result in the designation of a waterway. Waterway is a defined term under the City of Salem Code. It requires a designation by the director. That's at SRC 808-005. One of the other questions that came up that I think I want to address here that Mr. Grenz talked about briefly is the geotechnical testimony. We have a geotechnical engineer based on consultation with geologists that defines the site as buildable and stable. There have been isolated comments pulled from that document by the appellants, who then contend that those comments, without further analysis and without expert evaluation, indicate that there might be stability somewhere else on the property. There's nothing in that geotechnical report to indicate that there would be stability. That is unopposed evidence in the record from qualified engineers who went through a qualified process to address the site stability. And the developer has to incorporate that and consider that as the site is developed, as Mr. Grenz talked about. The wetland process here is important. There's going to be a delineation. To the extent wetlands are defined on site, work cannot be done within those areas without DSL and Corps of Engineers approval. So the developer, it's possible that a wetland is identified and it has to be avoided. There's a couple ways that can happen. If the building envelope that is depicted is in that waterway, the developer can alter that envelope and build around the wetland so it's not impacted. That would potentially eliminate the need for any DSL or Corps of Engineers approval, because there would be a direct way of developing without impacting that wetland. Or they can come back through the amendment process that was discussed here and modify a portion of the project to adjust to that process. But either way, there's going to have to be a delineation and identification of the wetland. And if there are wetlands, wetlands are very different than waterways. Waterways require a riparian corridor. There was some comment that riparian corridors around these potential tributaries that are perennial streams at best would need to be expanded with riparian corridors. That is not what the code says. It's not what state law says. Those would be wetlands that would be protected by the DSL regulations and the Corps of Engineers requirements. The comparisons with Goldcrest Brook, I think, are important. If you look at Goldcrest Brook and the conditions that cause that, it's a very different thing. You've got direct roof drains discharging into the brook. You've got uncontrolled discharge, a development that was built with significantly different standards. It's not going to control the outflows the way that this project has been designed. And if you look at the development standards that are urged by the commission that has studied Goldcrest Brook, those are the development standards that this site is designed to. So it actually provides an example of why the kind of approach that has been taken with this development is important, because it allows difficult to develop properties such as this one to be developed with much needed housing in ways that respect and preserve the environment. I was pleased to see the notation that very few trees are being removed. This is not a development where the site is going to be skinned and built. This is a development where a very limited number of trees are going to be impacted by the actual work, particularly those along the Riparian Corridor. The discussion regarding steelhead, there are no steelhead identified in this stream. The only fish that have been identified in this stream are not listed as endangered species. It's not been identified as a steelhead habitat. And so I think I'm at my 5 minutes, but hopefully I have touched on the points that you have had of interest. And if there's any other issues that you'd like me to address or questions, I'd be happy to address those to the extent I can.
Thank you, Mr. Hoyt. Questions of the applicants? Commissioner Kopcho.
Thank you, Mr. Hoyt. You mentioned the lack of expert review on behalf of the appellant and the retention of expert review on behalf of the applicant. In your, is it your belief that the applicants and individuals, or not the applicants, the appellants and individuals within the neighborhood association would have access to the same network and or resources to obtain such expert review as SSJH or Multitech or other developers?
Well, the answer to that question is, I would say, honestly, yes. There are, I have been in expert battles where there are multiple drafts and revisions responding back and forth to one another. Just as there are committed biologists who want to preserve fish, there are geotechnical engineers who are committed to development being done in responsible ways that are happy to participate. And so in today's world of readily available information through Google, I believe that kind of information is available to those people who seek it and seek to apply it. So yes.
Thanks.
Follow up, Commissioner Kopcho, is that good?
That's good for me. Thank you, Mr. Hoyt.
Okay, other questions of Mr. Hoyt? And Commissioner Slater.
Thank you. Mr. Wright, I wanted to go back to your comment about the geotechnical report. I did actually read it. And so I guess I have two questions. One is, it does look like the site sampling that the geologist did was on the upland area where you're doing hard infrastructure and not on the slope. Is that the case?
The diagrams that I have seen indicate that the sampling was done upland, correct? Yeah.
And then later the report writers, the engineers said that if there's going to be work done in the downhill area near the creek, there need to be additional studies done and additional consultation. Is that the case?
I'm not familiar with that specific language. It would not surprise me if they indicated that there are additional things that might be needed in certain circumstances, and that ties back to Mr. Davis's comments that you heard, that any work that is done on the site will be required to comply with the recommendations of the geotechnical report. So if any work is identified in areas that report requires further studies, those would have to be done, reviewed, and approved by the city before any permits could be issued or pulled. And that assumes that work could actually be done, because if it is in too much of a slope, it may get too close to the streams and be in the riparian area, which would require an amendment to the tree plan, which would require an entire new public process, or it could impact a wetland, which would trigger DSL requirements. So there's multiple factors that could weigh into that provide significant protections against any kind of unregulated or unapproved or unstudied geotechnical work on the site in areas that might have different stability factors.
But it is the case that, I mean, the appellants have speculated that that's a concern, and it is the case that the study that you've introduced, does not address that point.
I would disagree. I mean, I can tell you that the geotechnical engineer has not said that every inch of that site is stable, as no geotechnical engineer can do unless they study every inch. But I think the geotechnical engineer, who is a trained professional, has looked at the site and said, following these recommendations, these things will be there. And what you have talked about, and I think noted appropriately, is that there is speculation that something might happen. And we can't respond to speculation. We just can't, because I will tell you, as a professional whose job it is to deconstruct arguments and deconstruct documents, I can take virtually anything written by the most qualified person and find things that are unaddressed by their comments without some basis to say this is the defect in this report and this is the geotechnical information that I am relying on to demonstrate that there is a defect here. There is not information on which our geotechnical engineer can respond. Otherwise, we are disproving a negative. What about this issue? What about that? And that's an impossible question to answer for any professional. I would love a client that would pay me to answer those questions, because I could just sit around and talk to them for decades on end, collecting bills, answering questions that have potentially no answer.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Commissioner Slater?
No.
Okay. Any other questions from any of the other commissioners for the applicant? And not seeing any hands raised. Thank you, Mark. Here's our final opportunity to ask questions of staff before I close the hearing. Are there questions of staff? Commissioner Schweikart.
I'd love to get a really firm understanding of the city's, when the city makes a riparian designation, how that impacts the development of the site. Because I think I've worked in jurisdictions where there's somewhat of a difference in how things are defined, and then what comes out of that as a consequence of the designation. So it seems like from the materials that staff has provided, that the main impact is one's ability to remove trees. Is that correct?
And native vegetation.
And native vegetation.
For the riparian area.
So there is no, there's no identification of requirements or limitations with respect to impervious surfaces within that setback or erosion control measures within that setback.
So there's no requirements under Chapter 808 for those things. Erosion control, I think Glenn might speak. There's probably grading would require different permits through the Public Works Department. So there's different activities that would require different things depending on what the activity is. But there is no building setback. There's no you're not prohibited from building in the setback. You're not prohibited from having a house in that setback. So the 808 chapter only protects the native vegetation and the trees, and then I believe there's other public works chapters that would regulate grading and such.
Yeah, and I'll just again, kind of sort of off the top of my head, but Chapter 75 has erosion control, and those have special provisions that are in near waterways. Chapter 82, I believe, also has some. So we have grading chapters, we have erosion control chapters. There are chapters that speak to additional care at in riparian areas and waterways. So it's not the only opportunity to protect those areas.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Slater.
Thank you. Olivia, does the city have any standards by which they determine what waterways or springs or seeps should be preserved and what should be available to be developed or available to be, I guess, at risk, put at risk?
So the riparian corridor is determined based off of a waterway. A waterway is determined by the director. So I believe Glenn probably again can answer this better than I can, but that's by the director.
Yeah, and the director has traditionally used a variety of sources, but we have a stormwater master plan. There's a variety of council adopted maps that we have that answer that question. And so in this particular case, the preponderance of evidence was that the Willard Brook was the only waterway on the site.
So I guess I would have a follow-up question for Lisa, if I may.
You may.
So does the planning commission have an ability, or is there a mechanism by which new information can be brought to the director's attention, or are we legally bound to evaluate this only based on what the director has previously decided?
Wow, the first question you give me is a doozy. I might ask the city attorney to jump in if he thinks I'm answering this wrong, but I don't think that through a land use application is the appropriate time to redesignate or designate something for the first time as a waterway. There would be a process for the city to go through and update its waterway maps, kind of more of a legislative global action, but I don't think it would be through a specific land use application. Dan? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Concur with Lisa. There's legal restrictions on our ability to adopt new standards and requirements for land use applications once they've been filed. And the code lays out a process for designating waterways that's given to the director's discretion, not the planning commission.
Are you good, Commissioner Slater, or did you have a follow-up?
No, I'm not good, but I don't have any questions.
Okay, fair enough. Any other questions of staff? Give you guys a few minutes to ponder that. And seeing no other hands raised, I will look to Commissioner McKinley for a motion.
Madam President, I move we adopt staff proposal 4.1.
Okay, I will have a second.
Do we need to close the hearing?
Oh, sorry, I meant to close the hearing. Hearing is closed. Commissioner McKinley has made a motion. Now I need a second. Commissioner Pollack, is your hand raised for second or for discussion?
It's a discussion. What about the revision to, was it condition 12?
Condition 12. So,
yeah. Commissioner McKinley didn't address that.
So Commissioner McKinley, does your motion include the revamped condition 12 that wetlands delineation from the Department of State Lands has to be part of that condition?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so I have a motion. Mr. Easterly, I cannot recognize you at this time. I'm sorry. I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second by Levin.
Thank you so much. Discussion on the motion. Commissioner Pollack.
Oh, well, okay. First of all, there is so much information that bombarded us, and I really appreciate all the commissioners because it's very obvious they read all of it. And one of the things that I wanted to say is that it's not it is very compelling, and I have seen this in other appellant appeals, battling reports, professional reports. And it is very compelling here where we only have one professional report, and for somebody to come and say that it's false, I would welcome that, provided it's supported by another report, professional report indicating why those statements were false. The other argument that I didn't find compelling, and I really respect Mr. Beerley, but he says that no test results were done in the riparian area. Well, you know, the test pits were dug out 4 feet down to 6 feet to look for the groundwater. And seriously, we're worried about impacting the 2% of the outer 25. You think you're really going to want 6 feet test pits in the riparian area? I said that a reasonable person would question that. And I don't think that's exactly what anybody supporting watershed would really want. The other thing that is a geotechnical report indicates that any of this site, and I'm reading this, that any of the site work should be done between the months of the dry months through September, and that would obviously help with no runoff into the waterways by just because I've seen a lot of the construction, they do a lot of the grading, some of the grading in the wintertime, but the fact that this geotechnical report specifically says that they don't think it should be done except during the dry months will really help with a lot of the silt I think is worried that might run off into the creek. But most of all, I really don't want us to get into the slippery slope of extending our, again, I've always said, we as commissioners, our jurisdiction ends on the four corners of the code. And I really don't think that we should be putting our bailiwicks in other agencies' jurisdictions. When a condition like condition 12 says, hey, yeah, you know, it wasn't part of the inventory, but guess what? The inventory didn't include this. It's very reasonable. And it was the applicant that says, hey, we would be willing to change 12, saying, let's do a delineation report. Let's have somebody out there determine what is and isn't. And if it is, then let's do the state and the feds tell us if we can or we can't. And I think that's one thing. And the other thing is the phase 1 environmental. That's actually a liability issue that is a market-driven thing. You know, nobody is really requiring it. Basically, it's called the Innocent Landowners Defense that was revised onto another re-upped to another code. But basically, it's saying that if you don't want to be charged with somebody getting sick or cleaning up the environment, you better do your due diligence. And the ones that are always going to make you do the due diligence is the banks, because the banks don't want to be liable. So I really don't think that the city should be, again, telling the market what it should do. The market will take care of itself. And I don't think we should be getting into requiring a phase 1. And so for all those reasons, I think there's been a lot of safeguards here, and I'm going to vote to approve the staff report to accept the planning administrator's decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Pollack. Commissioner Kopcho, followed by Commissioner Levin.
Thank you, President. Like so many votes that come through the commission, this is a challenging proposition for me, because on the one hand, like Commissioner Pollack was just espousing, we're kind of limited to the decision criteria of the application submitted. And the city is facing a severe shortage in housing supply, so any additional housing development is certainly welcome. And on the other hand, there are standards that are absent from our code that would otherwise align to maybe best practices or state guidelines that are in flux. And a number of kind of unknown factors, I think, still remain, even with all the information that we were given and read through. And so while those unknown variables may come to light over time as the process moves forward, if we affirm the decision to subdivide the property, it would start a cascading series of events that would make slowing or reversing this in the future even more difficult. And so even if this application does meet the letter of the criteria today, and this could be a differing a sense of jurisprudence than I have than Commissioner Pollack, I'm not entirely convinced, based on the evidence presented, that it does meet the criteria today. But even if it does, I don't think it meets the spirit of the development approach that the city is currently pursuing in the UDC amendments to make changes to meet the state ORS and OARs, our Salem process, or the climate action plan. And further, I disagree that the characterization that a 27 lot development of $500,000 single family homes is the quote kind of planning the city should be encouraging. So as a result, I don't think I can vote to affirm the decision this time.
Thank you, Commissioner Kopcho. And just one of your comments, because I think this has come up before, and Lisa will correct me, but even though we are having these tangential work sessions on climate action and zone changes, we really can't make this decision based on projections of what that work is entailing. Correct, Lisa? She says, yeah. Commissioner Levin.
Thank you,
Yes.
President Griggs. I just want to state that I believe I did hear one of the folks giving testimony make a formal request to leave the record open. So we should discuss whether that is being respected in this situation, and or if it is a situation where it is now required because the request has been made.
Lisa, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, none of us, all the staff are saying we didn't hear that request. We heard a request to delay the decision for an indefinite amount of time. I don't think that's the same as a request to leave the written record open.
Yeah, I did not hear in infinite time. I thought there was a request from one of the public that gave comment to either hold the record open or extend the hearing, but I felt like there was a formal request there.
Our attorney wants to weigh in.
Thanks, Madam President. I believe Mr. Easterly mentioned something about if he had the ability to submit his written testimony, but I don't know that he actually made the request.
And Mr. Easterly has submitted that testimony by email.
Yeah, it wasn't Mr. Easterly. It was the it was the elderly lady that was speaking that had the cat in the background.
She asked for to be able to review the delineation, which was an infinite amount of time to be able to have a public process for the delineation to be reviewed, which is a state process. So,
okay. So moving on, comments that I have regarding our deliberations. I made some notes in regards to some of the comments that I've heard throughout, and so I want to voice my professional opinion or my personal opinion about some of those comments. There's been a lot of conversation about the steepness of the site and the high compaction and slide hazard. And it's really important that everybody acknowledge that the really steep portions of the property are in Riparian Corridor and cannot be touched. Therefore, they cannot be impacted. The request by the applicant to have some of those home sites overlap the outer edge of that Riparian Corridor, if approved, what would happen during the development process, because of the classification of the dirt and because of the angle of the slope, is some very stout structural retaining walls that are a part of the home itself. So when that issue of, well, there's steep slopes on the property that need to be evaluated, no, they don't. They are within a protected area, and we don't need to study them because they aren't affected by the streets and the home lots. A part of what makes a high compaction dirt is the continuation of load above it. And we don't have a steep slope that continues through the site. It changes in grade and it becomes much more manageable in an area where the streets and the lots are being developed. The issue of the wetlands delineation that has gone back and forth, and I appreciated that Glenn making the clarification. I'm sorry, actually it was the applicant, I think, made the clarification note. There's a difference between a waterway and there's a difference between a wetland. Waterways are always protected and wetlands can be removed or they can be filled, is basically what it happens. And in my conversation, unrelated to this application, with the Department of State Lands about the wetland delineation process, it is similar in Oregon to the carbon credit process. Wetlands don't go away. There is wetland that is somewhere else in the state that is identified by a property owner that they're willing to, I don't know, give credit or sell or something to give permanent protection to the state, that if somebody else somewhere else wants to fill their wetland, that other chunk becomes protected as an offset to the one that was filled. There may be some variation of that, but that was what I got from talking with Department of State Lands about an industrial site in North Salem several years ago. So, and that process is not a fast process. It takes a lot of work, it's expensive, and it takes months and months and months. And yes, you do involve the Army Corps of Engineers, which means you open everything up to the federal government. So it is not like it's a simple fill out an application and somebody stamps it and sends it back. The questions about the geotech and the report that was written, Redmond Engineering is a very well-regarded geotech engineer in the state of Oregon, and it's certainly reasonable, I suppose, to question an opinion, but that's why there is source data that goes with an opinion, and even an engineer, more than any, supply their source data of where that comes from. And so if other folks involved wanted to read that report in full, they do have the opportunity to go approach that engineer and ask for a copy, in which case the person who paid for it would need to give permission, and those who want a copy would need to pay that engineer for a copy of it. But they could read that, and I think that in not taking pieces out, but having the full report will really give some clarification. Engineers, especially somebody like Redmond, never extends or takes risk with their claims about stability of soils. And the reality is that, and Redmond was the engineer that did the assessment on the subdivision that my wife and I built our home in. And he had done it back in the 2000s when the subdivision was made. We bought our lot in 2016, and it was a high compaction lot. And it had a severe load above it. The high compaction zone dirt continued above. When we had our structural engineering done, we went back to Redmond and had them bring back up that file and review it, and then give opinion about where the house was being sited on our lot and whether we needed to do soil studies above. And the opinion at that time was, no, you need to study the areas of the lot that you are disturbing. Because it's high compaction, once you disturb something, it has to be retained. So to question the engineer without any other professional opinions to support why these questions are coming up, it really, to me, I discarded a lot of those comments because there is no validity to them, and it is non-professionals making an opinion about a professional's written statement. So I think it's really important that as we're talking about all this stuff, that we not get lost on some of the testimony that we received this evening, because not to be rude, but not all of it was correctly placed and did not have the appropriate source data to back it up. So from what I've seen in this application and what I've heard from the city, I will be supporting this application. There are the proper safeguards in place going into the future, that if during the wetland delineation process it is established that one of those tributaries or both of them are a waterway, that changes everything. And it's not hard to stop the development. That will stop the development, because as soon as that happens, the whole game changes. The street has to change, the lots have to change, and the developer will be back at the very beginning. It's their choice to do this process now, not wait for wetland delineation. So it's their risk that they're taking in doing this. And based on the application and what we see, I think this is something that I can stand behind and approve.
Thank you, Commissioner Levin. Commissioner Slater, followed by Commissioner Swikart.
Thank you. I accept the testimony of the appellants that there is a waterway where they're talking about Tributary A. I think they've put that into evidence. As a commissioner, I accept that evidence. Moreover, I think as a planning commission, we have a responsibility to safeguard existing natural resources. And I think the spring, the tributary, the creek is a natural resource. I think goal 5 gives us the ability to use our discretion in protecting our natural resources. While I appreciate both the applicant and the city's work to protect the riparian area, and I really have a problem with the geotechnical report. I think it's worth questioning, but I don't have a problem with it. Ultimately, I think that that preserving that area is important for the city. And it's important for the future, as Commissioner Kopcho suggested. And I don't think that if the Army Corps of Engineers or the state agrees to fill that in and have an offset somewhere in Eastern Oregon, that is as good as preserving it for us. So I'm going to be voting no on this. And I hope it comes back with some revisions.
Thank you. Commissioner Schweikart.
Hi. So I will echo Commissioner Kopcho's comment, which is that this is not an easy one. And as Commissioner Pollack said, there was a lot of information to digest and a lot of great testimony, both written and verbal today, that I really appreciated. And so trying to juggle a lot of different thoughts simultaneously about this decision. I think one is that we're not currently doing a design review application. This is not a building permit. This is a subdivision application, and we have to base our decision based on meeting the criteria of a subdivision application, which I think is hard because I think that we do naturally jump to some of the bells and whistles that go into a design review application and how to, hopefully get some of the amenities or restrictions that we want to see that can come into effect in a design review application, but that's not what this application is. So there's that. Another thing trying to juggle in my head is, I think this is the big one, is what I wish the city's code would say and what it actually says, because that is, I think, where we are really getting to the crux of a lot of the public testimony we've had and the neighborhood association's concerns and the watershed's concerns, council's concerns, which I think are absolutely valid. I disagree with the Riparian Corridor requirements of the city. I wish that there were more protections in place to eliminate the applicant's ability to build within that buffer. I think that if you were limiting the impervious surfaces there, you would be vastly reducing the risks that I think that we've heard from the public about stormwater runoff into the watershed, warming of the water in the creek area. I mean, that is a huge issue to me, that the city does not have anything in place to eliminate impervious surfaces, building structures within that riparian setback. I think that is an area of improvement for the city to look at. But I have to judge this based on what the city's requirements are actually for that area, which is unfortunate, but that's the case. I think another thing, is that there also is an ability for the members of the public that are citing a lack of information to base the decision off of. The planning administrator is basing the decision off of what is required to be provided by the applicant for a subdivision application. I think that maybe there should be a higher burden of proof, and that would be something we would have to add into the application requirements. I understand that requiring a biological report, that's not a high bar. It's not expensive to have a biologist go out and do a biological report. And then you have a lot of the stuff that you get from a wetlands inventory. So, I mean, that's something that could be added as an application requirement in the future that would maybe provide the public with that information they feel like they're really lacking right now in the way that our applications are presented. And so that's another recommendation for the staff, that it's something that's not provided at this time, but could be improved upon. Because I hear you that this is a really difficult one to feel like we have all the information. at our fingertips that we want to be able to answer these really tough questions, because the site's topography is, I mean, it is scary to consider development in an area where you both have, you know, a lot of geological challenge, and you have, you know, area that you want to protect in terms of natural habitat. You know, whenever you have a development in this, with a situation, you don't want to have to make a decision without all the pieces of information. However, you know, what we have heard, and this has been borne out in my own professional experience, is that the local jurisdiction does have to allow the state and federal regulatory bodies to have their chance to weigh in on this. You know, they will have their chance to weigh in. They will review the wetland delineation. They will review that information. And so I think that there's some maybe thought by the public that the city's punting, but this is actually the appropriate process. And so I just want to say that I've gone through that process myself as a professional. And as Commissioner Levin said, it is not an easy process to go through. It is not quick. So anyone who's thinking that the applicant's trying to get a quick decision here, that's not going to be the case. Trying to go through those regulatory bodies, they will have to be going through a long process to get approved for this, the way that they have designed this site. So I don't believe that the applicant is trying to rush through anything. And I think that within the confines of what the Planning Commission can base our decision off of for a subdivision application, that unfortunately, while I would love not to, I think that I would have to agree to uphold the planning administrator's decision.
Thank you, Commissioner Schweikart. Are there comments on deliberations, under deliberations? And I'm not seeing any hands raised. So Shelby, would you please call the roll and signify by aye if you are in favor of the motion, which is to affirm the planning administrator's approval of the case, and with that enhanced condition 12.
Commissioner Augustine?
Aye.
Commissioner Griggs?
Aye.
Commissioner Heller?
No.
Commissioner Kopcho?
Nay.
Commissioner Levin?
Aye.
Commissioner McKinley?
Aye.
Commissioner Pollock?
Aye.
Commissioner Schweikart?
Aye.
And Commissioner Slater?
Nay.
Motion passes.
Thank you. And thank you all of the commissioners for that very thoughtful comment and deliberation. We will move on to item 5.1, the UDC amendment work session. Vice President McKinley.
Oh, sorry.
Madam President, I'm sorry, but I have to bow out at this point. Is it going to ruin the meeting, or?
It's going
am
to
I free
destroy
go?
the meeting.
I know, but unfortunately, I do have things I need to attend to that came up during the meeting.
That is no problem, because we don't really have any other action. We don't need a motion, so you're good. You can go forth and conquer. We're ready for you now, Bryce.
All righty. Well, good evening, President Griggs, members of the Planning Commission, Bryce Bishop with the Planning Division. So here tonight for the third work session on the Unified Development Code. There's anticipated to be one more that'll be on August 17th. So we're getting close to the end of this package of amendments that are identified, for this 2021 UDC update. So the first set of amendments that I'll talk about are amendments that are proposed to implement House Bill 3109 that was passed by the state. It's a bill that deals with how local jurisdictions can regulate child care facilities, which include child care homes where care is provided in the home of the provider, and then child care facilities that are not provided in a residential unit. And so under this House bill, the state has changed the definition of what it means to be a family child care home and also a child care center. The main change to the definition of family care home is that it no longer is required that the care provider provide that the care provider live in the home where the child care is being provided. It just states that it's care for up to 16 children that's provided in a residential dwelling unit, and so it no longer has to be the home of the provider. So that change was made in the bill, and so we're reflecting that change in the proposed amendments to the definition of what a child daycare home means in the city of Salem to align with the bill. And then child care home must also be registered or certified under the ORS. And so registration is required if it serves, if the home serves 10 or fewer children, and then it has to be certified up to 16. So we've made that change. And then the bill also, for residential care or child care homes, it requires that they be allowed in all residential zones and commercial zones. And there can't be any restrictions placed on the allowance of the child daycare home that's more restrictive than what you would see in a residential home in a residential zone, or for another use in a commercial zone. So when we looked at all of the chapters where child care homes are allowed today, they're permitted in all of the zones outright. So there aren't any additional standards or processes that apply to them. The one area where we did have to change how they're allowed in a couple of zones included the Fairview mixed use zone and the neighborhood center mixed use zone, where child care homes are not outright allowed like the bill would require. So we've amended the permitted use tables in those two zones for the child daycare homes. On the other side of the coin, there's child daycare centers, the ones that are in facilities that are other than a dwelling unit. They must be certified under the ORS, and under the bill, they have to be allowed within any commercial or industrial zone, except jurisdictions don't have to allow them in a heavy industrial zone. And in reviewing where child daycare centers are allowed in the city, they're allowed in all of our industrial zones and our commercial zones, with the exception of the EC zone and the commercial high density residential overlay zone, which identifies its own specific list of uses that trumps the underlying zone. So we did have to amend the permitted use tables of that EC zone and the commercial high density residential overlay zone to allow child daycare centers in those two zones. And so those are the changes that are being proposed to implement House Bill 3109.
Any questions of commissioners? Is it easier to do questions section by section?
Yeah, I think so. That makes a lot of sense.
So any questions? You're free to carry on.
Okay. So the next one is another state House bill. This is 2583, and it deals with the state putting restrictions on how a local government can regulate the maximum number of people that can live in a dwelling unit. And what the bill says is that local government cannot limit the maximum number of people that can live in a dwelling unit based on their family relationship or their familial status. So our existing code, under the definition of family under Chapter 111, we define family as an unlimited number of individuals that are related by blood, marriage, guardianship, etc. All the the typical understanding of what a family is, but this amendment, the House bill precludes that, and so now we're proposing to change the definition to define family as an individual or any number of unrelated people living together in a dwelling unit. Currently, oh geez, I was told that I'm not sharing my screen. Jiminy Christmas. Sorry about that, folks.
Got it pulled up
okay,
on
there we go.
my computer.
Thank goodness. I alerted before I got too far. Okay. So this, again, State Bill House 2583 restricts jurisdictions from limiting the maximum number of individuals allowed in a dwelling unit based on family status. So currently we limit unrelated people to a maximum of 5 in certain zones, which include all of the residential zones and the commercial office zone and the Fairview mixed use zone. We also allow a resident family to take 2 additional boarders or roomers. So if you're unrelated, you can technically have up to 7 unrelated people living in a dwelling unit for that room and board additional provision that's allowed. So with the allowance or with the elimination of the restriction of unrelated people living in a dwelling unit, it really makes the allowance of 2 additional roomers and boarders unnecessary. So we've proposed to eliminate the room and board or the taking of boarders and leasing of rooms provision in the zones, because it's no longer relevant, because you can have an unlimited number of people living in a dwelling unit. I will note, however, that the bill doesn't change the requirement that the building code can still obviously limit the maximum number of people that can be in a dwelling unit based on the type of construction and the number of rooms and such. So there is still that control that will be in the building code. So that wraps up that one.
Any questions on this one from the commissioners?
I just had one. So Bryce, you're saying, what you were saying is that like there's still the requirements that are aimed to prevent overcrowding.
Yeah,
right?
through the building code. Yeah, fire and life safety issues.
Right.
Correct.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
And I don't see any other hands raised. So I think you're good to go on the next one.
All right, thanks. So the next set of amendments deals with Chapter 10 or Chapter 110, which was our general zoning provisions chapter. And so if you recall from, I think the last work session, we discussed similar use determinations, and that was a way by which we can formulate this as a city based upon a request from an applicant, do a formal interpretation process for how to classify use. Well, a code interpretation is a similar type of animal in that instead of dealing with classifying a particular use, the formal code interpretation process is used if there's a provision in the code that's ambiguous and an applicant is requested for a formal interpretation to be issued. So currently the formal interpretation process the formal interpretation can be issued by the planning administrator, or the planning administrator can refer that interpretation to the hearings officer. And in both cases, either the hearings officer or the planning administrator decision can be appealed to the city council. So in terms of the review authorities, we're proposing to change it just to the, like for similar use determinations, just to have it as the planning administrator. We're retaining the appeal to the city council, but we are, expanding, the process to make it more clear in terms of if there is an appeal, how that appeal is conducted, in terms of notice requirements, who the notice goes to. And Commissioner Pollack, you'll notice that, from the last work session on similar use determinations, we've put in the provision like you'd requested for similar use determinations that notice be given to the homeowners association. So that is in there. So the similar use determination process and the formal interpretation process are essentially, mirrors of themselves, except they're slightly different in terms of the submittal requirements and what is the basis for the administrator's decision, and if it's appealed, the council's decision. And there is a section in the code in Chapter 110 that essentially sets forth the rules of statutory interpretation of the code. And so you'll see in the formal interpretation section, there's in the decision part of the ordinance, it explains that in making the determination, you have the planning administrator or the city council have to, base their decision on those rules of statutory interpretation that are included in the code and the facts in the record. So it really just, tries to, make a cleaner, clearer, better review process for formal interpretation, for formal code interpretations, and those align with the ones for similar use determinations you've previously reviewed.
Any questions from commissioners? Okay, I think we're good on that.
Okay. So the next one is the property boundary verification process. And so that's in Chapter 205, which is our land division chapter. So the property boundary verification is a way by which if you have a building that is proposed to be built over a property line, it allows the applicant to establish the outside perimeter boundary of the individual lots that are held under common ownership as the perimeter boundary of the lot of a quote unquote lot for building code application purposes. It doesn't, however, do anything in terms of negating or getting an applicant out of complying with the other requirements of the UDC, such as setbacks for buildings and parking and vehicle use areas. And it's also a process that really isn't recognized in ORS 92, in terms of dealing with land division and reconfiguration. And it was just, established as a means to allow for buildings to be located over a property line, but it still doesn't, get you out of having to comply with the other requirements. So in a situation like this, where you see the two orange lines, which are property lines that go through the site, either that building has to have a fire separated wall where that line is, because that is a distinct unit of land that could be sold at any point, and therefore needs to meet the building code requirements, or they do either a property line adjustment or a replat, or currently this property boundary verification process. So it could solve, the PBV could solve the problem for the building code, but it's still, if this was a CR zone, for instance, and there was a 5-foot building setback on both sides of the property line for the building, it doesn't get them out of complying with that 5-foot setback requirement. And also where the property line goes to the parking lot, there would be, traditionally in our commercial zones, where there isn't a setback otherwise required, there's a 5-foot, setback from each side of the property line. So the PBV process is very limited to only the building code, and there are other processes in place, such as property line adjustments or replats if the properties involved are platted lots, that can clean up the lots and issue a more permanent situation, instead of just having this legal description that's recorded that establishes the outside boundaries of the property, but still, in this situation, there would still be 3 legal lots that remained that could be sold off at any time, and therefore result in issues with compliance with the building code down the road. So we think it's just a much better way to do either a property line adjustment or a replat, get them cleaned up, as envisioned under ORS 92, which is the statute that deals with land divisions, and so we're recommending elimination of the property boundary verification process from Chapter 205.
Great. Commissioner Pollack has a question for you.
All right.
I applaud you. Bravo on this. We had one decision that I tell you, when I made the decision, it was like, stick me in the neck on this one. So I am applauding you on this one. Thank you very much.
Wow, she's happy. Listen to that. You're on a roll. We're ready for the next one.
All right, on that, let's go on to the next one. So, general lot standards. So Chapter 800. So there is a section that has, in addition to the standards in the zone that establish, lot size and dimensions, we do have a section in the general development standards that apply generally throughout the city. So we are proposing to add a section that, in addition just to the regular lot size standards, that lots have to be of a size and shape that they can be reasonably developed, or be developed, exclusive, not reasonably, just be developed, exclusive of the setbacks, easements, and natural physical barriers that apply to a site, such as riparian corridors, which we've just talked about a lot tonight, floodplains, floodways. We want to make sure that lots that are being created have an adequate, area of land to be developed for their intended purpose. So we're proposing to add to the general lot standard section of 800, section that says, lots shall be of a size and shape that they can be developed, exclusive of all those limits, setbacks, easements, and physical limitations, floodways, floodplains, riparian corridors. And then also there's a section in that, or a subsection in that section, that talks about buildings to be on a lot, and essentially half of it talks about that you can't have a building over a property line. It's got to be on one lot, and then it says you can create condo, buildings and condos. But it also has another section where if you have multiple lots that are contiguous, that are under common ownership, that those lots are considered a single unit of land, or a single lot for purposes of the UDC. So that creates, a number of issues, saying that if you have multiple lots that are under common ownership and accommodated in a single development, that they're considered one lot. Is that, under that interpretation, that would mean, that kind of like a property boundary verification, it's the perimeter, setback that applies, but that doesn't take into account that you still have, all these existing interior, in this example on the screen, these existing, properties where you have, shared parking, a lot, driveways, kind of a little office complex here. And it is a single development, but they're in separate lots. And if they're in separate lots, they can be sold off at any time. And if that is the case, then, if something was developed without regard, to interior setbacks and, property lines, at the time it was originally constructed, just because it was under the same ownership, if it sold down the road, it'll become non-conforming when there are requirements for, setbacks, 5-foot setbacks for parking lots next to, interior property lines. So it's by eliminating the provision that says multiple lots under common ownership that are contiguous are considered one for purposes of development under the UDC, we're eliminating the potential of creating non-conforming units of land in the future. Because again, if we just disregard all these existing property lines and, oh, well, they're under common ownership, that's fine. They could be sold off at any time. And then, when they're sold off, now, they are no longer under that kind of that safe harbor provision, and they will be non-conforming. So we don't want to have a situation where we're creating non-conforming development in the city. So that wraps up those two.
Okay, any questions on this one? I think we're good. Oh, okay. Commissioner Pollock has a question backing up. Sorry. Commissioner Pollock.
Yes. So this comes to a point that I have probably butt heads with Lisa in the past, our planning administrator. When we have a development like you just said, and it's treated as a whole, at the end she makes this statement that says that if ownership ever changes, that any of these changes in conditions or setback are null and void. I never really cared for that, because I always understood that once you make these decisions, the decisions run with the land. So this avoids that little statement of Lisa, that Lisa says that you normally put. It doesn't matter what you do. I mean, in other words, when you make a large development on 3 plots of land, it doesn't make any difference on what you do, because in the long run, there's still 3 lots, and each lot has requirements that are not going to change.
Yeah, and I think, you're referencing probably that's a condition that comes about, and a lot of times if there's been like a request to, eliminate a setback or reduce a setback,
yeah.
We say that it's specific to that development, and then any change, it requires compliance. Yeah, so ideally, if you had a situation like this, having, those, either you have 3 lots and you want to keep the 3 lots for financing or for whatever reason you want to keep them, it would be great to, one, try to configure the lots in a logical manner. This, in this example, it looks like they are, running, and again, this is just trying to find, aerial photos throughout the city of examples, they are running the property line down, the potentially the driveways, and the code does allow a driveway that's, down down a common property line that provides access to 2 or more uses to negate or eliminate the 5-foot vehicle setback. But ideally, though, despite this example, the lots, you either want to combine them, and to make your development, or if you want to keep them as individual lots, hopefully they're laid out in a way that you can, do a design that meets the standards, and then it's easy to, sell, in the future if you want to, without having, again, things being non-conforming and needing adjustments down the road, for future addition to non-conforming development.
Okay, it looks like Lisa's going to take me to school, so.
Okay. Any other questions?
No, I just wanted to follow up, Commissioner Pollock. The conditions that we place on some of the zoning adjustments don't say that they don't transfer to new owners. It's that it, like Bryce said, only applies to that specific development. And that came about mostly for landscaping when we introduced the 15% site landscaping requirement with the UDC. And somebody would come in and maybe do an addition, and they would ask for an adjustment, and they would do landscaping around the addition, but they couldn't bring the whole site up to 15%. And so we'd approve it to be like, 10% or something. We wanted to make it clear that they weren't then forever approved with even new buildings to only be at 10%. Like the next time they come in for a development, the 15 would apply, and they'd have to try to meet it that time. And so that's what that condition is really about for the landscaping. But if they were to sell it and not change anything, the new owner would have the benefit of that adjustment, and it would run with that development as long as the development stays the same. So.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that to me.
Any other questions on this one? I think we're good, Bryce.
Okay, so next is a series of amendments to our pedestrian access standards in Chapter 800, which again is our general development standards chapter. And so under the existing requirements, and these were added, on the last GDC update, these standards for pedestrian access, where we've had some ability to implement them. We've identified some issues where they could be improved, and so that's kind of what these amendments are all about. And so currently, just as a refresher, pedestrian connections are required, between a building entrance and a street. And if you have a corner lot, to each street, they're required between, primary building entrances on the same development site, so people can get, between building to building safely. They're required to go through parking areas, to the street, as kind of would be seen here in this example, where you get the main entrance and the connection out towards the street through the parking lot. Also, if there are existing, planned paths and trails that are identified either in the Salem Transportation System Plan or the Comprehensive Parks System Master Plan, if there's a path or trail in that document, requirement to, provide either an easement, for it if no portion of it abutting the property has been improved, or build it through the site but if there is a portion of it that extends to the site that's being developed that has been improved, so extending that existing improvement. And then finally, to abutting properties when there's a driveway access provided. Again, the idea of if you're providing a shared, driveway vehicle access to a property, we also want to see a shared pedestrian connection, except in situations where if it's an industrial development where there's forklifts and trucks and heavy machinery that are operating, or there are other limitations that make it infeasible. Currently, the trigger for compliance with the pedestrian access standards comes about with development of the property. So it's at this point, pretty broad because it's based on, just development, and development has a broad meaning under the code. Under the proposed amendment, we are proposing to further define what development means for purposes of this section in the code for pedestrian access standards. And we're intending it to mean if you are doing an addition, or if you're constructing a new building, or you're doing an addition to a building, or a new accessory structure, or an addition to an accessory structure, that these pedestrian access standards are triggered. And in addition to, if you are, constructing, a parking lot or vehicle use area, you're altering a parking lot or vehicle use area, or adding to an existing one. And then we've also put in an exemption that if it's a small building, it's less than 200, or in a small addition or a small building that is less than 200 square feet in floor area, that is not a trigger for pedestrian access standards. And so these are intended to make it a little bit easier in term, and because development again is a kind of a broad term and can include several things under the code when we're trying to further refine it here to get at the kind of more the original intent and purpose.
I think Commissioner Le Pen has a question for you.
I do, thank you. So Bryce, I'm really glad to see this one on here. Professionally, I've been struggling with this on a somewhat regular basis since this got implemented into the development standards. And recently, the application that a client of mine is proposing to develop a site on McGill-Crest and 22nd with a series of buildings. During the pre-app meeting, they were told that you're going to get to do pedestrian connectivity between all these heavy industrial buildings and the two different street frontages for all the pedestrians that are going to be crossing through there. And it made absolutely no sense. And when I challenged the planner on it, she said, oh no, here's the code reference. And I went and looked, and it's very ambiguous in the code. It just says any development. And the samples that you've cited for justifiable applications of this are all retail sites. And when this was brought in front of us as a proposed addition to our development standards for Chapter 800, it was proposed for retail development sites. And when it got implemented into the code, that retail description of the types of applications that this should be applied to got dropped. And so my industrial clients that I represent, whether they're trying to remodel a building and add on to it, or trying to, like this current client that are trying to just build a new development, they're being stifled with this pedestrian connectivity on something where, as you noted earlier, it doesn't make sense to have pedestrian connectivity across areas where we have forklift traffic and we have tractor trailers circulating to back up to loading docks. But that's what planning has basically said, well, this is in the code, so now you have to follow it. And so I need to raise that. I like the changes that are being made. I really need to encourage that some definitions of the types of properties and developments or the types of uses be included. The great example here, and this is an easy one because my family backed the argument that was made many years ago to allow athletic use, group assembly in the IG zone. And that was because gyms were trying to move into industrial buildings and they weren't allowed in the code. And the particular case that drove that change was Athletic Edge when they resided out on Salem Industrial Drive. And so if we were to look at a site like this new one that's being developed and say, well, it's just a bunch of industrial buildings, we don't have uses yet, how can pedestrian connectivity be applied at that point? If all those buildings end up being distribution buildings, there's going to be, in 6 buildings, there's going to be a total of 10 people working, like on average, like a warehouse manager and a forklift driver per building. So it should almost be tied to a use where if a gym wants to come in, and let's say a Gold's Gym or 24-Hour Fitness wants to come rent one of those buildings and put a use there, then I could see, okay, well, now you're going to bring potentially 150 or 200 consumers, not industrial workers that are going to their factory job. Though that seems like what this code was intended for and where it would best be applied then to industrial property, but having it be there generically requires a new developer to put in all this, the raised separate material, so concrete sidewalks and all that stuff across a 9-acre industrial site. It's getting pretty cost prohibitive. And it's a real problem. There's a couple others that we have on that particular development, but as far as the pedestrian access, that was really looking at connecting the front doors on all those buildings. It created more danger and conflict for people transiting between buildings than it did creating the intent of the code, which was supposed to be safe pedestrian travel, originally through retail parking lots where people were getting hit by cars.
Well, I think with we do want people to be able to, walk, build a walk from the, the street, to, like the entrance, to an industrial building too, potentially there, because you could have maybe, a client just parked on a street and walking in or something, or so we are looking to have that safety as well. I think in terms of the shell building, issue, if you're doing an industrial development or a building in an industrial zone that does allow, some limited variety of industrial and a lot of industrial, limited variety of like supportive non-industrial uses, like you mentioned, the gyms and like a daycare centers that we just talked about that have to be allowed under that state House bill. And if you're just building a building and you're doing site plan review and we don't know what the uses are going to be, that will be in the building in those buildings at that time, there's no way for us to, because that's the ideal time you need to provide the pedestrian access is when you're doing the site development. So if the zone is such that it allows uses that we would otherwise want to see, connectivity, for, and we don't get it with the original building permit, I had to think about more and understand how that could be done in a reasonable and, fashion, when you come in for a first time tenant improvement, of the building in that group of buildings that was being developed. So I don't know, I don't have an answer to that, but I do hear that concern. And yes, there is that standard for pedestrian connection between, abutting sites, where if you have one site in it and there's a vehicle access that's shared to the other, we do exempt the connection, if there are forklifts and everything. But there are areas where you don't have to like go through the yard, to get to the building, if it's the main connection, from the entrance to the street. I think that can happen in a lot of respects. And I think if I maybe just jump to these next ones too, because these are also ones that deal with pedestrian access, we're trying to get at, the pedestrian connection to the streets, and then also the pedestrian connections between the buildings that you might have talked about. Probably doesn't solve them all, but it's trying to get there at least. So on this next one, if you have a building that's on a corner lot and it's close, now it's within 20 feet and it has, a pedestrian access, a primary pedestrian access within 20 feet of one of the streets. Today the code would say you have to have connections to both streets, but if this building were, it's probably a little bit more than 20 based on, the aerial photo in the driveway. But if it were 20 and the access, to it was here and it was within 20 and that connection was to the street and there were sidewalks on, around the corner, you wouldn't have to also have another connection that goes, from the primary entrance down to this street, because it's kind of silly if a primary entrance is within 20 feet of a street to make another parallel one essentially to get down to this street. If the building is more than 20 feet away, it will still have to have a connection, to both streets, because we want to again facilitate, the ease of pedestrians to get to either to the main entrance from either street. But if the building is so close that it's the main entrance is within 20 feet of the street, it's not very much to walk from the entrance to the sidewalk and then walk around. And so that's that one. And then the other one we're proposing here is a similar concept, but if you have several buildings on one development site. Now these are very clustered. I'm just trying to find examples, but they could be somewhat further away too. If these buildings, if there's like 100 feet, 200 feet between them, if they were both within, or if they both had primary entrances that were within 20 feet of the street, and those entrances had connections, each of them to the street, and there was the sidewalk, up in the street right of way that connected those entrances, you wouldn't have to then also, do like, connection somewhere else. Now, oftentimes that will happen, like in this example, you have a parking lot and there are oftentimes, sidewalks that are provided, either sidewalks have to be provided between the parking and the street, or landscaping has to be provided. This one has sidewalks, so they would be connected by this path anyways. But if this was just landscaping to separate the parking lot from the street, the code today would kind of technically say that you have to have a connection between these buildings. But as long as we're saying if the entrances are close to the street, and they're connected to the street, they can essentially use the public sidewalk, for the connection between them. Now that doesn't solve the situation that you're talking about, Commissioner Levine. If there was like that this was an industrial site and there was another building back here, there would still be a requirement, to connect the primary building entrance of this building to that building. But another thing we are doing is we've put in here a provision that we're not requiring the connection to buildings that are, service, storage, or maintenance, kind of oriented, that are not primarily intended for human occupancy. So we're trying to provide some flexibility there. So if it's just like a storage area, or like a fuel place, or your fuel pump building or something, or storage area, if it's not intended for, primarily to have, people in there all the time, we're proposing not to require a connection between those, but there still would be, connections that would be required for industrial uses at this point with what we've proposed. We're trying to, modify them a bit, but there still would be, requirements for the industrial buildings to have their entrance connected to the, to the street, and between the buildings as well, unless they were storage, service, or maintenance buildings that weren't really intended for human occupancy primarily.
Is that the last slide for this one?
It is.
Okay, this is probably a good point. We're butting up to our 9 o'clock adjournment time. So we do need a motion if we're going to continue. I think you just have one more to go through, Bryce, isn't that correct?
Yeah, the requirements for chapter, the tree preservation chapter.
So I'm looking for a motion to extend for 15 minutes our meeting.
I'll make a motion to extend for 15 minutes.
So Levin made the motion. Do I have a second?
Slater.
Slater is our second. Thank you, Commissioner Slater. Bryce, we can continue.
Okay. And the last chapter in this set of amendments we're
All
talking
right,
about.
you need to actually vote on the motion.
Oh, sorry, that's right. Yes.
Oops.
Discussion on that motion? Nope. All those signify by saying aye. Shelby, will you call?
Aye.
Well, Shelby needs to call the roll.
I'll go fast. Commissioner Augustine.
Aye.
Griggs.
Here, yeah, aye.
Commissioner Heller.
Aye.
Copcho.
Aye.
Levin.
Aye.
McKinley's absent. Pollock.
Aye.
Schweikart.
Aye.
And Slater.
Aye.
Thanks.
That took like 1 minute of our 15 minutes. Okay, the 15 minutes starts now.
Okay, and I'll even talk faster. I'm just kidding. So the last or set of amendments are the amendments to their tree preservation ordinance or chapter, which is chapter 808. The proposed amendments to this chapter are kind of broken down to changes to definitions, changes to tree removal permit requirements and exemptions for permits, and then tree conservation plans, and then tree protection measures and enforcement. So the first one, in terms of definitions, we're proposing to introduce a concept in the chapter, which is essentially recognized in the existing tree protection measures that apply to significant trees, which would be oaks at this point that are 24 inches or greater at chest height. That it's the critical root zone, and so if and that is based on a ratio of 1 foot of radius for every 1 inch of DBH of the tree, or diameter, or breast height, or chest height. So if you had, for instance, a 10-inch tree, the ratio, the critical root zone would have a radius of 10 feet from the trunk of the tree, and that's intended to, and it would go all around the tree, and so that's intended to essentially kind of capture the drip line of the tree, and the roots of the tree that are critical to its long-term health and stability. And currently under the code today, we require that in a tree conservation plan, you have to preserve at least 70% of that critical root zone area to maintain conformance with the chapter by an above ground silt fence. And so we'll talk about that more later. But so we're defining what the critical root zone is, and we're going to be applying it, or proposing to apply it a little bit more broadly with these amendments than currently required. We're also proposing to expand the definition of significant trees. So today, a significant tree is any rare, threatened, or endangered tree of any size. And then also the primary one that we regulate is the significant Oregon white oak, which is 24 inches or greater DBH. Under the proposed amendments, in order to promote greater tree preservation and the preservation of trees that have survived for a longer period of time and are more significant, we're proposing to expand the definition of significant tree to include trees with a diameter breast height of 40 inches or greater. So it would essentially be Oregon white oaks 24 inches or greater, and then any other tree that's 40 inches or greater. And then we're proposing to relocate the definition of waterway. It was established, and this is to reflect the previous amendments we talked about with House Bill 2001 that requires us to establish a setback for middle housing next to waterways. And so since that definition is going to be used in more chapters than just the tree chapter now, we've moved it to chapter 808. So, the big changes are, the critical root zone introduction and definition, and then expanding the definition of significant tree to include 40-inch trees or greater.
Do we not have a critical root zone defined now?
No, we don't, though. In terms of in terms of trees on private property regulated by chapter 808, the only thing that it says under the existing section is that it allows on tree conservation plans, or that it not allows, but it requires if you have a significant tree on a property, that at least 70% of the area, and and we just define the 1 inch or the 1 foot radius for every 1 inch. We just explain that in the section that says we can put a condition on the tree conservation plan for that. But it isn't a general thing, and it only just applies to significant trees. Other than that, it just says the tree shall be marked And it doesn't say what. It could just be like a ribbon on it, I suppose, or a silt fence, but the code today doesn't specify the critical root zone for trees. It only does for significant trees.
Okay. Any questions on this particular slide?
I'll just say that in my professional experience, I've had an issue where that wasn't defined. And so it actually does have a real world implication that I can speak to as for personal experience. So I appreciate it.
Commissioner Slater, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. So I'd encourage us to find a way to bring in some greater awareness of the difference between tree species when we talk about a significant tree. So I think there are probably a number of species that we would consider significant and would want to preserve, even if their DBH is lower than 40. And I'll give you an example, would be a native hemlock. If we have a native hemlock in here that has a 28-inch DBH, I think that's definitely a significant tree. So my preference would be, instead of just having this 40-inch or greater, would be to find some way to bring in the urban forester and his division to create maybe a list of species that would qualify for significant tree with a lower DBH than 40.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got that note.
Thank you.
Other comments on this particular slide? And I'm not seeing any hands raised. Bryce, I think you're good to go.
Okay, so the next one deals with tree removal permits. And so currently under Chapter 808, there's an exemption from the requirement to obtain a permit if you're doing an industrial or commercial development. And it's just a blanket exemption. It just says if the removal is necessary for the construction of a commercial or industrial facility. So we are proposing to eliminate that, but in its place, putting in a requirement for getting a tree removal permit. So the need for the removal can be documented, and the ability to possibly explore alternative means to, save, the tree are kind of vetted before we just, say that the tree can be, removed without, knowing for sure that the site can be maybe developed in a way that could accommodate it. And then the other one is there's an exemption from obtaining a tree removal permit if you want to remove an Oregon white oak on a lot of record as of August 9th, 2005. So that's been almost 16 years ago. We've just feel that, it's one, I guess, maybe a little bit hard to, kind of track, especially, when, people are calling in, at the pack counter, it's like, well, it was a lot of record on August 9th, 2005. That takes a lot of research, and it's been, quite some time. So we feel that, since white oaks are significant, that, we don't know if this exemption is really necessary anymore. In a way, I think it was kind of established as kind of a transition or grace period, for the adoption of these new amendments and to lessen their impact. But we've had now 16 years, and we have a process to get a permit to remove an Oregon white oak on a lot, and so we just don't feel that exemption is really necessary any longer. We are, like I said, we're establishing a new approval criterion, a fifth approval criterion for the removal of a tree with a permit, and this one deals with, if you need to remove a significant tree for a commercial or industrial development, but then also we've added for any other development like mixed use, multifamily mixed use as well. So it's multifamily mixed use, commercial and industrial. If you have a property that these types of developments don't require tree conservation plans, they just require site plan review and building permits. So if you have a significant tree on a lot and you're proposing to do these developments, there would be a way to, remove the tree upon showing you meet some new criteria that are established. And there are three criteria. One is that you just have to demonstrate that without approval of the permit, the development would require the approval of a variance or adjustment. So, the trees are located in such a manner that it forces the building or the parking lot to be located in a manner where I've got to ask for a reduction to a required setback or another development standard of the code. That'd be the first thing you'd have to demonstrate. And then you'd have to demonstrate that there are no reasonable design alternatives to allow that tree to be preserved. And then, not more than wouldn't be able to remove more than 5 significant trees or 15% of the significant trees on the property. You can remove more than 5 trees or 15% of the trees, of the significant trees. So limit on how many you could remove, but then also just a requirement that you demonstrate that there's no reasonable design alternative to enable the trees to be saved, and that, without it, you'd have to ask for a variance or an adjustment to the code for another standard.
Yeah. Any questions on this slide? I think we're good.
The next one deals with the tree conservation plans. And so currently tree conservation plans are required for any land division, partition, or a subdivision that's creating lots for the construction of a single family dwelling or a 2-family dwelling or duplex. Under House Bill 2001, we had to, treat, single family or the middle housing. So 3-family, 4-family, and cottage clusters consistent with what, we require for single family and 2-family. So because tree conservation plans are required for single family and 2-family, we're also requiring, if you're creating lots to be developed for 3-family, 4-family, and cottage clusters in a subdivision or a partition, that you also have to submit a tree conservation plan with that development. And with the tree conservation plan, in order to allow staff to more adequately review the tree conservation plans and really understand, whether or not the trees that are being identified on the plan can actually be saved, we're proposing to require that that critical root zone, be shown on the plan as well. And so by seeing that critical root zone on the plan, we can then compare building envelopes, the setbacks, to see, okay, if the lot were to be maximized at its setbacks, is half of the critical root zone of a tree in the required building envelope. And if that's the case, that should be somewhat of an alert to, well, where maybe we're setting up that tree conservation plan that's being proposed for failure, and then whoever buys those lots in the future where they want to maximize the development of the lot and go to the setbacks, we don't want to create a situation where people are having to just come in with tree conservation plan adjustments, because under the approval criteria for tree conservation plan adjustments, it really only is intended to apply where there are circumstances that were unforeseen and that couldn't have been foreseen at the time the tree conservation plan was approved. I think we've probably more generously applied the tree conservation plan adjustment standards, but if we have more better data up front, and we can see the lots that are being created, the building envelopes in terms of setbacks, the minimum setbacks that are required, and then we can see where the critical root zones are, we can get a better feel for, yes, that those trees, their root zones are outside the setback, and therefore, yes, their applicant has identified those to be saved. Yep, they can be preserved. But if they're showing trees that have, most of their or a majority of their root zone in like a building envelope or a building setback area, or the building envelope exclusive of setbacks, then that's a sign that, well, maybe that tree is not going to be able to be saved. And so it just helps us to have more data and be able to make more informed decisions, and less, hopefully, changes to tree conservation plans down the line. We're also proposing to increase the max or the minimum preservation requirement in tree conservation plans from the existing standard, which is 25%, to a minimum standard of 50%. And this change and the others we're seeing here with this chapter, they're trying to address, the various programs or study and studies that the city is trying to do in terms of dealing with climate change, dealing with quality of life, climate, the climate action plan, all of these various things. Our Salem, the testimony that we're hearing from the community, there's a desire to save more trees and have better tree preservation. So we're proposing these revisions to try to get at that. And then the final section or change for this is that currently there's a condition of approval section that says what you can condition on a tree conservation plan, and it specifically identifies a couple conditions. One of those conditions is that the trees have to be protected during construction, and if it's an oak, a significant oak, that's where the 70% area under the tree, under the drip line of the tree, has to be marked with an above ground silt fence. So we moved that provision out of the condition of approval section, which is kind of buried, and put it into its own section that just deals with, tree protection measures during construction. And that's under 808-046. And that's where we have, and well, I'll pause here. I'll talk about that one next.
So I'll get to Commissioner Pollock in just a second, but a few of us were given the heads up about this increase in the standard from 25 to 50% during our zoning subcommittee last week. So so I'm trying to understand the logic. I know that I have colleagues on this commission that are very much in favor of that increase, but some of us that are working with how do we get higher densities, how do we get this middle housing on these lots, if we're then expecting the developer to preserve even more of the trees, it's hard to create that density that you're looking for and we're looking for as in response to the climate action work, while at the same time keeping more trees. And there have been many cases that have been in front of us where we get proposals that the developers really are retaining more trees than they need to retain. So they're not, I think they do their best to preserve everything possible as far as the trees. And I just think that it's such odds with what we're trying to do in creating higher densities with the few lots that we have remaining. So that's just my comment. And I will go to Pollock. I think she had her hand.
Oh, you hit it on the nail. I think this flies in the face of density.
Yeah.
No, we when you're talking about carbon neutral, I mean, it's like either people or trees. There's just no way with the scarcity of land and then the topographical issues you have to deal with the land that's left, especially in West Salem and South Salem. I just think that this 50%, it's just that's a no-go for me.
Yeah. Commissioner Levin, followed by Slater, then Copcho.
Thank you. Honestly, part of me does not have an issue with requiring 50% of trees that were on the property at the start of the development be there in some form or shape after the development is completed. What I have a problem with is that it's a tree preservation and that we don't have a tree replacement in anywhere in this that I'm hearing. And the idea that we can somehow keep trees in their, for lack of better words, natural location and state, when we are pushing dirt and converting otherwise natural land into something that has been man altered. I think this proposed code amendment is going to create so much conflict that without a path for developers to be able to say, look, I gotta clear these trees, we can keep a set number of them, but otherwise to try to, like on the hearing that we heard today with elevation changes and trying to meet grading standards, the need to remove trees that are where those roadways are going to go is going to be a really big deal if that developer had to keep 50% of the trees on that lot.
Yeah.
So I think there needs to be another piece to this, that developers need to be able to replace trees. And I also want to just take this time to shamelessly plug another concept of mine, and that's using a tree incentive for developers. So giving, let's pick on home builders. If a home builder, they only got to plant one tree and a couple bushes. They don't even have to put lawn in technically. So if we didn't require, but incentivized in the tree code that if a developer was able to keep a tree instead of cutting it down and replanting a replacement, that they could get so much of a discount in a permit fee or something to that effect. Just like if a developer replants more trees than just the one that's required by code, it'd be a great opportunity to create an incentive to say, like, for every extra tree you plant, you get $100 off your permit fee. I think that would go a long ways with developers. But I think the fact that the biggest issue that I have with the way this is written is that there's no opportunity to replace. And so that's the hang up for me here.
Let me just say for the record, though, in Chapter 80 or 808-050, there is a tree planting requirement, and so and it's based on the size of the lots, and we're proposing a change to that. Just a small change in terms of only requiring one tree if you're creating on the ultimate lot that you're creating that's less than 4,000. But if you're creating a let's say a typical lot of between 4 to 6, in addition, so you have the tree conservation plan, the trees you're saving, and then if you, then every lot in that partition or subdivision also has to have the number of trees that are identified in that tree planting table. So if you've created a subdivision that has, 20, 4,000 to 6,000 square foot lots, each one of those lots would have to have 2 trees on it. Now, if there are, trees on lots, that were preserved under the tree conservation plan, you don't need to worry about planting anymore because you already have those 2, saved, already have your saved trees on the lot meeting the standard. But if there are lots that don't have the trees, there is a minimum number of trees that are required to be planted on every lot based on the lot size. So we do have planning in that respect.
Before we continue the conversation, we need another motion to extend for 15 more minutes. And I bet you it's either going to be Heller, Copcho, or Slater since they want to talk. Do I have a motion?
I move to extend the planning commission meeting for another 15 minutes.
Okay, my second.
Levin, seconds.
Then vote on the motion. Will you call the roll? Discussion on the motion? Probably not, but is there discussion on the motion?
Case Copcho here.
Gotcha, Copcho.
I'm happy to vote aye on this one, but man, if we do it again, I don't know.
Okay, that's a good discussion point right there. Okay, Shelby, will you call the roll?
Commissioner Augustine?
Aye.
Griggs?
Aye.
Heller?
Aye.
Copcho?
Aye.
Levin?
Aye.
Pollock?
Aye.
Schweiker?
Aye.
Slater?
Aye.
And McKinley is absent.
Okay, talk fast because we have somebody from the public who wants to testify too. So Commissioner Slater.
All right. No surprise, I'm generally in favor of preserving trees when we're doing development, but I'd also say that 50% does create some challenges for the development that we do need in the city. My concern is more about the preservation of large mature trees than it is about the total percentage of the overall lot. And that's because mature trees provide a significant ecological benefit for habitat, for climate change, for carbon sequestration, for reducing the heat island effect. So I would encourage us to flip the conversation a little bit from numbers, which I know can seem a little bit arbitrary and probably raise the blood pressure of every developer who reads this, to a little bit more around the idea of the quality of the trees that we're preserving. I think there's a way that if we are thoughtful about this, we can probably thread the needle and come to some sort of broader agreement within this commission and within the community about protecting an important resource.
I think that's a great approach, Commissioner. I think that was a good comments. Commissioner Copcho.
Yes. I'll echo Commissioner Slater's comments. I agree with them wholeheartedly, and also just add that I know that staff takes into account a lot of things when they put together this package, this proposed amendment. They don't just pluck the 50% out of the air. They're looking at a number of other sources. So I trust them on that, but I also trust our developers. If we are putting it out there, especially if there are height restrictions that are lifted, and I know we're changing some things on heights for multifamily and other things, because if you're, you can certainly build taller and you're not going to reduce any tree footprint by building a taller building. So if you want to increase density, I'm just saying there are options and innovations out there to still be dense and keep trees. So I would also be interested, like Commissioner Slater said, in looking at the preservation of the mature trees. So.
Other comments or questions for Bryce? Okay, Bryce, is there another
So,
slide to this one?
yeah, the last one, and I'll do it real quickly here. So, so this is the new section on trees or tree protection measures during construction. So what it now says is that it's expanded, the tree preservation requirement for the above ground silt fence to not only, significant trees, but also any tree that's designated for preservation in the tree conservation plan. So surround those trees with surround the trees critical root zones with the above ground silt fence to protect them. Still 70%, requirement, but we do have an allowance, for if you submit a report from a certified arborist that identifies ways that you could do grading, in that area and still, maintain the health and integrity of the tree, that you can, as long as you follow all the recommendations of the report. So we provided some flexibility there. You just bump down, the tree planting requirement to 1 if you're creating a lot that's less than 4,000 square feet in size, such as if you're doing a townhouse subdivision with 1,500 square foot lots, or or a little bit bigger. 2 trees would be hard. 1, in a front or backyard, can work. And then also we've just amended the section on under enforcement that deals with the replanting and restoration plan. Really right now it's focused on replanting. And so what we do is we look at the value of the trees or native vegetation that's been removed. And then there has to be an appraisal and a value assigned to the damage that was done and the value of the trees that were removed. And then, whoever violated the code has to then go forward and then do replanting based on the value of the trees lost. So if you cut down a bunch of oaks illegally, you're going to have it's going to be a high, assessed value for the trees, and therefore there's going to be a lot of replanting. And so when you look at, having to replant that many trees in in maybe a limited area, it just doesn't work. So we've amended this section to require replanting, but then, after you get the replanting done and you can't really put any more trees in the area, that was where the trees were removed, then whatever remaining balance from the assessed value of the damage caused, net out, how much you've, paid, for the tree planting, you just pay that remaining balance as a fee into our tree conservation fund, our tree canopy fund. So it allows, for tree restoration throughout the city. So if you replant first, and then any remaining value in terms of what you need to pay that can't be made up by planning goes as a fee into the tree conservation fund.
Okay, questions from this slide? I think we're good.
Yeah, and that's the last slide for the evening.
Okay, thank you for the presentation, and we will move on to public comment. We have 1 person signed up to testify, Mike Erdman. And as a reminder, if you could state your name and address for the record, Mike, and you have 3 minutes.
All right, I will do that. Mike Erdman with the Home Builders Association, 2075 Madrona Avenue. I appreciate your time. I know that you want to get back to your families and other things as much as I do after 4 hours of this. So no surprise here to talk about concerns that we've got with the tree preservation requirements that are proposed. And as mentioned, really, it's just concerns that we're kind of heading down this path of conflict with the new requirements for greater density. Taking the requirements to 50% from the current 25, while at the same time we've got a whole separate process looking at mandating new density minimums is just inherently a conflict. And I'm going to tell you, it can't be done. Virtually all of the development land we have left in Salem is problematic with slopes. And so when you've got to regrade a site to get your streets to meet fire code, you've got to get your intersections flat to meet federal disability requirements. You've got to get flat, areas for your home sites. You just can't do that and preserve that degree of trees. And especially now that we're looking at minimum densities, we're going to shrink those lots. We're going to leave less land available for yards and, of course, for the trees that we want to preserve. And so I guess what I'd urge of you is that the city and you as policymakers really, we need to look at, where are our priorities on this, because you can't do both. I understand that folks want to see more trees preserved. We want to see more density, but at the same time, that's an inherent conflict. And I guess I just tell you, before this goes too far, and again, it's on a separate track from the density issue, kind of bring these together, because they've got to be talked about together, because they really play off each other. And I know I've talked to Lisa specifically about this, and kind of the answer I've gotten is, well, gosh, 50%, if you can't do that, you're just going to have to come back in and demonstrate there's no alternative. But what I'd say is that setting really what's an unrealistic and unworkable standard, and then telling applicants to come back in and show there's not an alternative, is really, really bad public policy, because it just invites further conflict with the neighbors and the neighborhood associations who don't understand what's involved in developing a site. And what they do is they just see the city letting development out of the standards that the city has set. And so it's going to lead to more appeals. That increases costs. It increases the time that it takes to get a project through the process. And all of that contributes to the problems we've got with housing supply and affordability challenges. And so, and ultimately, really what it does is it kind of pushes the development community and our buyers and our renters outside of Salem. And that's what we're seeing right now. They're going more and more towards our surrounding communities and commuting in. And of course, that runs directly counter to what all of this is trying to achieve. And that's making a meaningful impact on climate change. So I guess I appreciate the earlier comments from many of you kind of understanding the challenges that are here. And really we just ask that staff sit down with the development community so we can try and hash through this stuff and see if we can get a better proposal. You know, I appreciate what's happened on the density side. Eunice has been really proactive in reaching out. I think we've had some good suggestions that have come from that. We've had absolutely no input on this. And no discussion on the tree preservation. That needs to happen. And so appreciate your comments. Happy to answer any questions, but it's getting close to 9:30. I know we all want to wrap up and get out of here.
Any questions of Mr. Erdman? I'm not seeing any hands raised. Oh, thank you, Mike, for your time and your patience. Okay, moving on, no information reports, no public comment. Planning administrators report, you have like just, oh, Commissioner Schweikart.
Well, I'm wondering if Lisa's going to do it, but because it was related to the UDCs, but like we got public comment separate from our packet from Chariots that was related to the UDC amendments. So just wondering, do we need to like, is that just like in the record or we got to talk about it?
It was submitted. Lisa, how do you want to manage that?
Yeah, I think we should talk about it, but maybe we can just move to the next work session. So we're going to have another UDC work session on the 17th. And so I think we could talk about it then. And then we'll come back with some, also just to touch on the trees, we'll come back with some something different, maybe proposed on the trees based on comments tonight and other comments that we're receiving, although we're also receiving comments and support, I would say. So I don't think we have time tonight to talk about the Chariots because we only have a few minutes. Unless you want to say something as parting words, Commissioner Schweikart. My only planning administrator report is I'm not sure we're going to be in person on the 17th, and I'll keep you posted by email. We do have a meeting on the 3rd. It will be virtual. I won't be here. Olivia will be here in my stead. I'm sure she'll do a great job. But otherwise, I'd like to give it to Commissioner Schweikart if you have any parting words for your fellow commissioners.
I hope I'm not frozen. Can you guys see me?
Yeah, we can see.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, cool. Well, I would say that for your next UDC session, I support the recommendations of Chariots in terms of the removing parking minimums for the middle housing and the extending the parking minimum waiver zone to half a mile for multifamily. So I'll just put in my plug for that for next time when I won't be here. No, I just want to say thanks, everybody. I really appreciate the great relationships that I formed with my fellow commissioners and staff since 2018 when I joined the commission. And I will be moving to Cincinnati, Ohio this week. So I will, this is my last meeting but I'm going to miss this group and all the really interesting conversations that we have. And I'm really excited for all of the things that our Salem and other efforts are doing. So I'll like lurk and stalk you from afar. Don't worry, from Cincinnati. But I hope that you find some great replacements for both me, but I know that we have 2 more people that are terming out in December. So we have a kind of a changing of the guard here with the commission. So I just look forward to seeing everything that happens moving forward. But I'm going to miss this group and thank you so much for allowing me to be part of it.
Well, you've added such great value to just about every discussion we've had. Commissioner Swikart, and you will be missed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. We will miss you, definitely.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Did you have any more to your planning administrator's report? Mrs.
No, Commissioner Pollock had wanted us to play a video, and so I hope it's okay, Commissioner Pollock, if we'll move to the next meeting.
Yeah. Either that or Casey Copcho's going to kill me. So.
And I won't be chairing the next two meetings because the third I'm on vacation. Well, actually, both of them on vacation. One of them I can't come back for because I'm in the Grand Canyon, hopefully not at the bottom of the river. But you'll be in good hands with McKinley. I think that's it. Right.
Thank you, everybody.
Anything else for the good of the order?
No.
We're adjourned.
Bye, Ashley. We'll miss you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.